In this video, we're breaking down 2 hours of disturbing Family Guy episodes to fall asleep to. Let's get started. First up, we got Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q. Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q. Family Guy Season 10, Episode 3, aired on the 30th of October 2011, and immediately became one of the most controversial episodes in the show's history by tackling domestic violence with a storyline that ended in premeditated murder. The episode centers on Glenn Quagmire's sister Brenda, who is trapped in an abusive relationship with her boyfriend Jeff Feckelman, and the extreme lengths her brother goes to in order to protect her. This was Family Guy attempting to handle serious subject matter while maintaining its trademark dark comedy, which created a viewing experience that felt wildly different from typical episodes about Peter getting into wacky misadventures or Stewie plotting world domination. The episode opens with Peter and Joe returning from a fishing trip, but Quagmire is mysteriously absent. When they check on him, they discover he attempted autoerotic asphyxiation that went wrong, leaving him hospitalized. While Quagmire recovers in the hospital bed, his sister Brenda arrives with her boyfriend Jeff. The episode wastes zero time establishing that Jeff is abusive. He complains constantly and shows controlling behavior immediately, but Brenda agrees to take care of Glenn during his recovery, despite Jeff's protests. The show sets up Jeff as an antagonist through his personality alone before any physical violence appears on screen. His voice drips with contempt, and every interaction with Brenda involves him belittling or dismissing her. The writers made Jeff so immediately unlikable that viewers already dislike him before understanding the full extent of his abuse. As Quagmire recovers at home with Brenda caring for him, Jeff keeps the entire neighborhood awake with his constant shouting and ranting. The show uses this as dark comedy, with neighbors tossing and turning while Jeff's voice echoes through the night. Lois decides to reach out to Brenda by inviting her to lunch at a restaurant. During this scene, Brenda wears sunglasses inside the restaurant, which is presented as an obvious red flag. When Lois questions why Brenda keeps the sunglasses on indoors, Brenda eventually removes them to reveal a black eye. This moment lands with uncomfortable weight because the show drops its usual comedic tone entirely. Lois reacts with visible horror, and Brenda immediately begins making excuses for Jeff's behavior. She justifies the abuse, claiming he only gets violent when stressed, or that she somehow provoked him. Lois responds with disgust, but Brenda remains defensive of Jeff despite the evidence literally visible on her face. This conversation shows the psychological manipulation that keeps abuse victims trapped in these relationships. Brenda has internalized Jeff's excuses and genuinely believes she shares responsibility for his violence against her. The scene shifts to The Drunken Clam, where Peter, Joe, Brian, and Quagmire discuss the Jeff situation. Quagmire expresses genuine fear that Jeff might eventually kill Brenda. Joe, being a police officer, explains that legally he cannot intervene until after a crime occurs, which highlights the frustrating limitations of how domestic violence cases get handled by law enforcement. Joe suggests staging an intervention instead. The intervention scene becomes one of the episode's most chaotic moments because it goes completely off the rails. Meg suggests that Brenda should try to change Jeff, showing a fundamental misunderstanding of abuse dynamics. Chris gets angry at Joe for calling him the wrong name and derails the conversation, and Peter somehow pivots the entire intervention toward discussing cigarette smoking instead of domestic violence. The absurdity of these failures makes Quagmire's eventual heartfelt speech to his sister hit harder by contrast. Glenn speaks directly to Brenda about his fears for her safety and genuinely seems to break through her defenses. Brenda appears ready to leave Jeff until Jeff himself walks into the room. When Quagmire tries to escort Jeff out, Jeff stops everyone cold by announcing that he and Brenda are getting married because she's pregnant. This revelation traps Brenda further into the relationship and adds urgency to Quagmire's concerns about her safety. That night, the guys play cards at someone's house, while Glenn continues obsessing over Jeff's treatment of his sister. Peter casually mentions that he wishes they could just beat Jeff up. Quagmire immediately jumps on this suggestion, but escalates it dramatically by recommending they kill Jeff instead. The conversation takes a dark turn as Quagmire genuinely argues for murdering Jeff. Joe, representing the voice of legal reason, tries to stop this plot from developing further, but then they witness Jeff through a window, verbally berating Brenda before striking her. This moment of witnessing actual violence against Brenda causes everyone, including Joe, to agree to the murder plot. The show presents this as the turning point where even the police officer character decides that killing Jeff is justified because the legal system failed to protect Brenda. This plotline pushes Family Guy into territory the show rarely explores, where characters commit a premeditated murder and the narrative treats it as heroic rather than criminal. The murder plan gets put into motion when the guys invite Jeff on a midnight hunting trip. Jeff agrees despite being suspicious of Quagmire's motives. During the drive into the woods, Jeff openly acknowledges that he knows Quagmire hates him. Peter almost accidentally reveals their plan to kill Jeff, creating tension as Jeff seems to sense something is wrong. Jeff excuses himself to urinate in the woods, and Quagmire picks up his hunting rifle, preparing to shoot Jeff when he returns. But Jeff sneaks up behind Quagmire instead and points his own gun at the back of Quagmire's head. Jeff launches into a rant about knowing what they planned, then pistol whips Quagmire to the ground. The power dynamic completely shifts as Jeff takes control of the situation. Joe reaches for his shotgun, but Jeff threatens to execute Quagmire by shooting him in the back of the head. Joe uses his police negotiation training and suggests everyone puts their weapons down. Jeff surprisingly agrees to disarm, creating a tense standoff where both sides lower their guns. Joe promises they will all forget this ever happened if Jeff walks away. Peter and Quagmire initially agree, but then Quagmire refuses to let it go. This refusal to back down triggers Jeff's rage again. Jeff knocks both Peter and Joe unconscious with his shotgun, then forces Quagmire into Peter's car at gunpoint. Jeff drives them deeper into the woods, openly stating his intention to kill Quagmire far from where anyone can find the body. Quagmire, beaten and facing execution, uses psychological tactics by challenging Jeff's masculinity. He taunts Jeff by suggesting that shooting him would be too easy and that a real man would fight with his fists. Jeff takes the bait and agrees to beat Quagmire to death instead of shooting him. What follows is a brutal beating where Jeff pummels Quagmire relentlessly before strangling him until he collapses. The show animates this violence graphically, with sound effects emphasizing each impact. Jeff believes he killed Quagmire and grabs a shovel to bury the body. As Jeff begins digging, Peter's car headlights suddenly illuminate him. Jeff turns around in shock to see Quagmire standing up. Quagmire delivers a darkly comedic line about how he practices autoerotic asphyxiation every day, calling back to the episode's open, so choking does not affect him the same way. Before Jeff can react, Quagmire guns the car's engine and runs Jeff down, crushing him against a tree. The impact kills Jeff instantly. This sequence combines the show's dark humor with genuine violence in a way that makes viewers uncertain whether to laugh or feel disturbed. The next morning, Peter, Joe, and Quagmire return to Quagmire's house, where Brenda waits in tears because Jeff never came home. The three men present Brenda with a forged note supposedly written by Jeff, claiming he decided to leave her. The note absolves them of suspicion, while also giving Brenda closure that Jeff left voluntarily rather than her needing to escape him. Brenda's reaction devastates the group because instead of relief, she breaks down crying over Jeff's departure. This response illustrates how abuse victims often still love their abusers despite the violence. Brenda's tears show the complex emotions involved in these relationships, where fear and love become dangerously intertwined. The episode concludes with Peter making a joke about wanting to kill someone else and suggesting Mort Goldman as a target, which returns the show to its typical dark comedy tone, but feels jarring after the serious subject matter just addressed. The episode generated massive controversy for multiple reasons. Family Guy tackled domestic violence, a serious real-world issue affecting millions of people, then resolved the storyline through vigilante murder presented as justified. The show argued through its narrative, that when legal systems fail to protect abuse victims, killing the abuser becomes acceptable. This message troubled critics and viewers who felt the episode glorified taking the law into your own hands. Additionally, the episode mixed serious dramatic moments with the show's typical crude humor, creating tonal whiplash. Scenes of genuine abuse sat alongside jokes about autoerotic asphyxiation and Peter's typical buffoonery. Some viewers appreciated the show attempting to address domestic violence awareness, while others felt Family Guy trivialized the subject by wrapping it in comedy. The episode also sparked discussions about how television portrays solutions to domestic violence. By having the protagonists murder Jeff and face zero consequences, the show presented an unrealistic fantasy resolution. Real abuse victims cannot rely on friends committing murder to escape their situations. Critics argued the episode should have shown Brenda finding strength to leave Jeff herself, utilizing restraining orders, domestic violence shelters, or other real resources available to abuse victims. Instead, the episode made Brenda completely passive in her own rescue, while men decided her fate through violence. This reinforced problematic tropes about women needing male protectors rather than showcasing female agency in escaping abuse. The pregnancy subplot added another layer of controversy. Brenda announces she's pregnant with Jeff's child, which historically traps many abuse victims in relationships because they fear raising children alone or believe children need both parents. The episode never resolves this pregnancy storyline. After Jeff dies, the show never mentions whether Brenda remained pregnant, had the child, or what happened. This loose thread frustrated viewers who invested in Brenda's story only to have it abandoned after Jeff's death. The episode treated the pregnancy purely as a plot device to raise stakes rather than exploring the realistic implications of an abuse victim carrying her abuser's child. From a character perspective, the episode showcased a side of Quagmire rarely seen in the show. Glenn is typically portrayed as a sex-obsessed pilot who serves as comic relief through his exaggerated libido. This episode revealed genuine depth by showing his protective love for his sister and his willingness to commit murder to save her. The scene where Quagmire pleads with Brenda during the intervention shows real vulnerability and emotion. Seth MacFarlane's voice acting conveys desperation and fear that breaks through Quagmire's usual sleazy persona. The episode proved Quagmire could carry dramatic weight when the writing demanded it, which added complexity to a character previously defined by one-note sex jokes. Joe's character arc in the episode also deserves examination. As a police officer, Joe initially represents the legal system's limitations in protecting abuse victims. He explicitly states he cannot arrest Jeff until after Jeff commits a crime, highlighting how law enforcement often arrives too late in domestic violence situations. But then Joe participates in Jeff's murder, showing that even someone sworn to uphold the law saw extrajudicial killing as the only viable solution. This character choice either critiques how the legal system fails abuse victims or suggests that violence against abusers is justified when legal channels prove inadequate. The episode never clarifies which message it intended to send. The episode's animation during the final confrontation is notably more intense than typical Family Guy episodes. The fight between Jeff and Quagmire features detailed impact frames, bruising, and blood that makes the violence feel grounded rather than cartoonish. When Jeff strangles Quagmire, the camera holds on Quagmire's face as it turns purple, emphasizing the genuine danger. This realistic violence contrasts sharply with the show's usual slapstick, where characters recover instantly from injuries that should be fatal. By animating the abuse and violence seriously, the show forced viewers to confront the real harm rather than dismissing it as cartoon violence. The musical number in the episode, where Brenda sings a childhood nursery rhyme to help Glenn wake from his coma, provides the episode's most tender moment. Caitlin Olsen, who voices Brenda, delivers the song with genuine emotion that cuts through the show's typical cynicism. This scene establishes the deep sibling bond between Brenda and Glenn, making his later actions feel motivated by love rather than machismo. The nursery rhyme callback also emphasizes how abuse victims often have rich lives and relationships beyond their abusers, contradicting the isolation abusers try to impose. The drunken clam conversation where the murder plot forms is disturbing because of how casually the characters discuss killing Jeff. Peter suggests beating Jeff up as a joke, but Quagmire immediately escalates to murder, and the group accepts this escalation without serious moral debate. The show presents premeditated murder as a reasonable response rather than an extreme action that should provoke soul-searching. This casual attitude toward killing another person, even a clearly villainous person, reflects a troubling view where violence against abusers is entertainment rather than tragedy. Real domestic violence advocates emphasize that abuse victims face the highest danger when leaving abusers or when outside parties intervene, which this episode completely ignores by presenting the murder as a clean solution. Family Guy rarely faces lasting consequences for character actions, but this episode takes that to an extreme. Peter, Joe, and Quagmire commit murder, forge evidence, and lie to police. Joe is police, yet face zero repercussions. The episode ends with them successfully fooling Brenda and presumably getting away with the crime permanently. This consequence-free resolution sends a problematic message that murder is acceptable if the victim deserves it, which is a dangerous philosophy to promote through entertainment. The show could have explored guilt, legal consequences, or moral complexity, but instead treated Jeff's death as purely positive, despite it being premeditated homicide. The episode's placement in Season 10 came during a period when Family Guy frequently attempted to tackle controversial, serious subjects. Other Season 10 episodes dealt with religion, disability, and other sensitive topics with varying degrees of success. The show seemed determined to prove it could handle dramatic storytelling beyond its typical crude humor, but this episode demonstrated the challenges of balancing Family Guy's established comedic tone with genuinely dark subject matter. The result was an episode that satisfied neither viewers seeking pure comedy nor those hoping for a thoughtful exploration of domestic violence. The episode exists in an uncomfortable middle ground where the comedy undercuts the drama and the drama makes the comedy feel inappropriate. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Seahorse Seashell Party. Seahorse Seashell Party. Family Guy Season 10 Episode 2 aired on the 2nd of October 2011 as part of Fox's Night of the Hurricane event that affected all three Seth MacFarlane shows. The episode became notorious for its dark psychological examination of the Griffin family dynamics, centering on Meg Griffin's role as the family scapegoat and featuring graphic drug-induced hallucinations. Written by Wellesley Wild and directed by Brian Iles, this episode stands out as one of Family Guy's most emotionally disturbing episodes, despite lacking the physical violence present in other controversial installments. The episode explores psychological abuse, self-harm during drug use, and the devastating moment when an abuse victim convinces herself that accepting mistreatment serves a greater purpose. The episode begins with a hurricane forcing the Griffin family to stay inside their home together. The television goes out, leaving them without entertainment and stuck in close quarters with nothing to distract them from each other. This setup immediately creates tension because the Griffin family typically avoids spending concentrated time together. Brian decides to cope with the boredom by ingesting psychedelic mushrooms, which sets up one of the episode's two major disturbing storylines. Meanwhile, the rest of the family sits around feeling bored and naturally begins insulting Meg, which represents their typical behavior, but escalates throughout the episode into something far more psychologically damaging. Brian's drug storyline takes a graphic turn when he starts experiencing hallucinogenic effects. He leaves the room while tripping, and Stewie follows him out of concern. Stewie discovers Brian cutting off his own ear while under the influence of the mushrooms. This scene references Vincent van Gogh's famous self-mutilation, but seeing it animated with a main character makes it genuinely disturbing rather than artistically referential. Stewie patches up Brian's ear and decides to stay with him throughout the entire drug experience to prevent further self-harm. As Brian continues hallucinating, he sees weird and disturbing imagery that the episode animates in detail. The show commits to portraying a realistic bad drug trip rather than treating psychedelic use as purely comedic. Brian's hallucinations involve distorted reality, frightening visions, and complete loss of control over his perceptions. Stewie acts as a trip sitter, trying to keep Brian calm and safe while he experiences these intense psychological effects. The storyline with Brian and Stewie serves as a dark counterpoint to the main narrative about Meg, but both storylines explore similar themes of psychological torment. Brian inflicts harm on himself while unable to process reality correctly, while Meg endures harm from her family members who are fully aware of their actions. The episode juxtaposes physical self-harm during altered consciousness against psychological harm inflicted by sober family members, suggesting that intentional cruelty might be worse than drug-induced accidents. The main storyline focuses on Meg and escalates when Peter hums along to the opening theme from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Meg opens a can of soda, and the resulting noise causes Peter to snap at her aggressively. This moment shows how the family treats Meg's mere existence as an annoyance. She cannot perform a basic action like opening a beverage without receiving hostility. Instead of accepting this treatment passively, as she typically does, Meg turns on Peter and fights back verbally. This marks a significant departure from her usual character behavior, where she absorbs abuse silently. Both Lois and Chris join in attacking Meg, demonstrating that the entire family participates in her mistreatment. Rather than backing down, Meg responds by systematically pointing out each family member's faults. Meg's attack on Lois proves particularly devastating. She verbalizes criticisms that cut through Lois's self-image and force her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. The episode does not specify exactly what Meg says to Lois, but the transcript indicates Lois is left devastated by whatever truths Meg reveals. Meg then drops a bombshell by stating that when she turns 18, she does not know if she wants to be around any of the family ever again. This statement represents a breaking point where Meg openly acknowledges that her family relationship causes her such distress that she considers cutting off all contact once legally able to do so. The fact that an 18-year-old would contemplate completely abandoning her family speaks to the severity of mistreatment she endures. Peter attempts to inject humor into the situation with a comment, trying to deflect from the seriousness of Meg's statement. Meg refuses to let him escape accountability and brings up that Peter's faults may be the worst of all. She points out that his kids are disasters, which prompts a small protest from Stewie, who apparently takes offense at being called a disaster. Peter initially tries to laugh off Meg's criticisms, but eventually it dawns on him that he has been genuinely insulted. The delay in Peter's comprehension adds dark comedy because he cannot immediately recognize that his daughter just verbally eviscerated him. When Peter finally realizes Meg attacked him, he turns to Lois for support, expecting her to defend him. Instead of supporting Peter, Lois rips into him for not supporting her when Meg criticized her. This creates a domino effect where the family's united front against Meg collapses and they turn on each other instead. Chris, Lois, and Peter begin attacking one another, revealing that removing Meg as their common target exposes the dysfunctional relationships between the other family members. Peter runs off in tears, showing genuine emotional damage from the confrontation. Lois goes after Peter, presumably to continue their argument or attempt reconciliation. Chris also leaves the room, unable to handle the family conflict. Meg sits alone, reflecting on her actions and observing the chaos she triggered by refusing to accept her usual role as family punching bag. The episode's most disturbing moment comes during Meg's reflection. Having watched her family turn on each other when she stopped accepting abuse, Meg concludes that she serves a purpose as the family lightning rod. She decides that her role is to absorb everyone's frustrations so they do not direct their negativity toward each other. This realization represents a deeply unhealthy psychological coping mechanism where an abuse victim justifies their mistreatment by framing it as noble self-sacrifice. Meg convinces herself that accepting verbal and emotional abuse protects the rest of the family from harming each other. She essentially decides that her suffering prevents greater suffering for others, which is a tragic rationalization that real abuse victims often employ to make sense of their situations. Meg apologizes to her family for standing up for herself and speaking the truth about their faults. She takes the heat and allows everyone to blame her for the fight that occurred. The family readily accepts this narrative where Meg caused the conflict rather than their own cruel behavior toward her. Everyone feels better about themselves after scapegoating Meg, which returns the family dynamic to its toxic baseline. The episode ends with Meg having learned that asserting boundaries and demanding respect destroys family harmony, so she must accept mistreatment to keep peace. This conclusion sends a genuinely disturbing message because the narrative rewards the abusers and punishes the victim for attempting to escape her role. The episode generated significant controversy for its psychological themes. Unlike other disturbing Family Guy episodes that feature graphic violence or shocking content played for dark comedy, this episode presents emotional abuse in a realistic framework. The family's treatment of Meg reflects real patterns seen in dysfunctional families, where one member becomes the identified patient or scapegoat. Psychologists recognize this dynamic, where families unconsciously designate one member to absorb all dysfunction, allowing other members to avoid addressing their own issues. The episode portrays this pattern accurately, which makes it disturbing because viewers recognize the authentic psychology behind the cartoon violence. Meg's decision to return to her scapegoat role particularly troubled mental health advocates, who noted the episode shows an abuse victim convincing herself that abuse serves a purpose. This rationalization appears frequently in real abuse situations, where victims tell themselves they endure mistreatment to protect others, keep peace, or fulfill some greater purpose. By having Meg reach this conclusion and framing it as character growth or self-awareness, the episode arguably glorifies accepting abuse rather than escaping it. The episode never presents an alternative where Meg maintains her boundaries and the family is forced to address their dysfunction. Instead, it suggests that family unity requires someone to sacrifice their well-being. The Brian subplot with mushrooms adds another layer of disturbing content through its graphic depiction of self-harm during drug use. Seeing Brian cut off his own ear while hallucinating presents drug use as genuinely dangerous rather than consequence-free fun. The episode does not glamorize psychedelics, but instead shows them causing Brian to lose touch with reality so completely that he mutilates himself. Stewie's role as caretaker emphasizes how drug users put others in difficult positions when they cannot control their actions under the influence. The episode shows Stewie feeling responsible for keeping Brian safe despite being a child who should not bear that burden. The animation during Brian's hallucinations deliberately unsettles viewers with distorted imagery and disturbing visuals. The show's typical art style becomes warped and nightmarish during these sequences, creating genuine discomfort rather than entertainment. The episode commits to portraying a bad trip realistically, showing how psychedelics can cause terrifying experiences rather than purely positive spiritual journeys. This serious treatment of drug use contrasts with many Family Guy episodes that show characters using substances with minimal consequences. From a character development perspective, the episode reveals important information about Meg's psychology and her understanding of her family role. Previous episodes showed Meg accepting mistreatment without exploring why she tolerates such behavior. This episode provides an explanation by showing Meg consciously choosing to serve as the family scapegoat. Her decision transforms her from a passive victim into someone actively participating in her own abuse, which somehow makes her situation even more tragic. Meg is intelligent enough to recognize the family dysfunction, but chooses to enable it rather than escape it. The episode also exposes the Griffin family's complete inability to function without a scapegoat. When Meg stops accepting blame, the family immediately devolves into attacking each other. Peter, Lois, and Chris have no healthy conflict resolution skills and require a designated target for their frustrations. Without Meg absorbing negativity, they cannot maintain civil relationships with each other. This reveals that the Griffin family's apparent unity is entirely dependent on systematically abusing one member. The family bonds through shared cruelty rather than genuine affection or healthy communication. Peter's character in this episode demonstrates particularly cruel behavior even by his usual standards. He snaps at Meg for the simple act of opening a soda can, showing how her presence itself irritates him. When she fights back and articulates his faults, he cannot immediately comprehend being criticized by someone he views as beneath consideration. His eventual emotional breakdown when Lois does not defend him reveals his fragility and dependence on others, validating his ego. Peter serves as the family's primary aggressor toward Meg, while simultaneously being emotionally weak himself. Lois's participation in Meg's abuse adds another dimension, because mothers typically protect children from mistreatment. Lois not only fails to defend Meg, but actively joins in insulting her. When Meg accurately criticizes Lois, she responds with devastation rather than self-reflection, showing she cannot handle the same treatment she inflicts on her daughter. Lois's decision to attack Peter when he fails to support her demonstrates her hypocrisy. She expects support she does not provide to others. Chris's role is smaller but significant because he represents a sibling joining in rather than defending his sister. Chris follows his parents' lead in treating Meg poorly, showing how children learn abusive behavior patterns from parental examples. The episode suggests this dysfunction will continue into the next generation because Chris already participates in scapegoating behavior rather than recognizing it as wrong. The hurricane setting provides forced proximity that makes the family confront their dynamics without escape options. In typical episodes, family members can avoid each other by leaving the house or retreating to separate rooms. The hurricane traps them together, removing these escape mechanisms and forcing sustained interaction. This pressure cooker environment exposes the dysfunction that usually stays somewhat hidden through avoidance. The lack of television removes their primary distraction, forcing them to actually communicate rather than silently coexisting while watching entertainment. The episode's placement in Season 10 as part of Fox's Night of the Hurricane event means it aired alongside hurricane-themed episodes of other McFarlane shows. This shared theme created expectations of light disaster comedy rather than the psychological horror the episode delivered. Viewers expecting hurricane jokes and physical comedy instead received a brutally honest examination of family abuse dynamics. The tonal mismatch between expectations and actual content amplified the disturbing impact. The episode's conclusion, where Meg sacrifices herself, remains its most troubling element. Rather than showing Meg escaping abuse, maintaining boundaries, or the family facing consequences for their cruelty, the episode validates their dysfunction by showing it works for everyone except Meg. The family is happy, relationships are restored, and only Meg suffers the psychological cost of her martyrdom. The episode frames this outcome as acceptable or even necessary for family stability, which sends a harmful message to real abuse victims who might identify with Meg's situation. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Brian and Stewie. Brian and Stewie. Family Guy, Season 8, Episode 17, aired on the 2nd of May 2010 and became one of the show's most psychologically disturbing episodes, despite featuring only 2 characters and a single location. Written by Gary Janetti and directed by Dominic Bianchi, the episode traps Brian and Stewie in a bank vault for an entire weekend, forcing them to confront extreme situations, including coprophagia, suicidal ideation, emotional manipulation, and the brutal honesty that emerges when 2 characters have no escape from each other. The episode strips away Family Guy's typical cutaway gags and ensemble cast to create an uncomfortable 2-character chamber piece that explores the darkest aspects of Brian and Stewie's relationship. The episode begins with Brian going through his safety deposit box at the bank while Stewie accompanies him. They begin arguing about a sweater, which represents their typical bickering dynamic. As Stewie prepares to leave, the vault door automatically shuts and locks, trapping both characters inside. This triggers an immediate crisis because Stewie has defecated in his diaper. The episode wastes no time establishing the severity of their situation. They try calling for help, but receive no response because the bank is closed and nobody can hear them through the vault's thick walls. Stewie explains that he cannot remain in his soiled diaper, creating the episode's first major disturbing scenario where they must figure out how to handle his waste with limited options. Stewie concludes that Brian must eat his feces since they have no other way to dispose of it while trapped in the sealed vault. Brian reacts with complete revulsion to this suggestion, which any reasonable person would. The conversation escalates as Brian claims he would rather shoot himself than eat Stewie's feces. This statement draws attention to a gun Brian keeps in his safety deposit box, which becomes significant later in the episode. They struggle over the weapon, with Stewie eventually gaining control and threatening Brian with it. The struggle stops when they realize Stewie has a mobile phone, offering hope for rescue. Unfortunately, the phone has extremely low battery life. Instead of immediately calling for emergency help, Stewie wastes the remaining battery calling a sweater store to resolve their earlier argument about clothing. This frivolous use of their only communication device enrages Brian, who slaps Stewie and tells him to go away. The slapping moment shows Brian physically striking a toddler out of anger, which crosses a line even for Family Guy's dark comedy. Brian feels guilty about hitting Stewie and eventually gives in, agreeing to eat the feces to resolve the diaper situation. Stewie undoes his overalls and they remove his diaper. The episode animates this sequence in uncomfortable detail, rather than cutting away or treating it purely as an off-screen joke. Brian forces himself to eat the feces, and the sight of this causes Stewie to vomit. Brian then eats the vomit as well, though the transcript notes he does this willingly, rather than being forced. After consuming both the feces and vomit, Brian licks Stewie's bottom clean. The episode commits to showing this degrading act rather than implying it happened off-screen. After redressing Stewie, they prepare to sleep and realize the next day is Sunday, meaning the bank will remain closed and they must spend another full day trapped in the vault. This coprophagia sequence represents one of the most genuinely disturbing moments in Family Guy history because the show plays it seriously rather than purely for shock comedy. Brian experiences real disgust and humiliation while performing these acts. The scene forces viewers to watch a beloved character degrade himself in ways that go beyond typical cartoon violence or crude humor. The episode explores how desperate situations can force people to do things that violate their fundamental sense of dignity. Brian's willingness to eat feces and vomit demonstrates either his care for Stewie's comfort or his complete lack of self-worth, both of which are psychologically troubling interpretations. Brian wakes first the next morning and retrieves a drink from his safety deposit box. When Stewie questions what Brian is drinking, Brian offers him liquor. They both get buzzed and then drunk, with Stewie dancing while Brian joins in before falling on his face. The fact that Brian gives alcohol to a toddler and gets him drunk represents another disturbing element where Brian enables dangerous behavior. While intoxicated, Stewie requests that Brian pierce his ear, and Brian agrees to perform this body modification on a child while they are both drunk. As they prepare for the piercing, their conversation drifts to various topics, including the bounty hunter and politics. Brian accidentally reveals he voted for McCain in the 2008 presidential election. Brian rams the piercing pin into Stewie's ear, but it gets stuck. He then rips it out forcefully, causing excessive bleeding. Performing amateur body piercing on a drunk toddler with makeshift tools in unsanitary conditions represents incredibly reckless behavior that could cause serious injury or infection. The excessive bleeding shows the piercing went badly wrong, yet they continue drinking while Stewie bleeds from his ear. This casual approach to a child's injury demonstrates how their trapped situation has degraded their judgment and care for safety. While still drinking, Stewie asks Brian about the dog whisperer, leading to a conversation about whether dogs have purpose in their lives. Brian explains that dogs do have purpose, including himself. Stewie denies that Brian specifically has purpose, triggering an argument that escalates into one of the episode's most emotionally brutal moments. Stewie claims he only uses Brian, that Brian has no purpose in life, and that Stewie only wanted Brian to eat his feces to see how low Brian would go. This confession reveals that Stewie's earlier request was not about necessity, but about psychologically manipulating and humiliating Brian for entertainment. Stewie treated forcing Brian to eat feces as an experiment in degradation rather than a solution to their trapped situation. Brian responds to this revelation by pulling the gun on Stewie, showing that Stewie's words hurt him enough to consider violence. Stewie deflects by pointing out that a security camera has recorded footage of Brian licking feces from his bottom, which will eventually be discovered when they are rescued. This realization devastates Brian because his humiliation will not remain private, but will be documented evidence that others will see. Stewie picks up the gun jokingly, but it accidentally discharges. The bullet ricochets around the small vault, and they take cover under a table. The accidental discharge shows how their playing with a loaded weapon in an enclosed space could have killed them both, adding another layer of danger to their already desperate situation. The next morning, they wake up after sleeping under the table. Stewie does stretches and notices his ear, which is still injured from the botched piercing. Brian sits reading while Stewie reveals he has had energy bars hidden the entire time. This means Stewie allowed Brian to worry about starvation and forced him to eat feces despite having actual food available. Stewie's decision to hide the energy bars shows calculated cruelty rather than thoughtlessness. He deliberately withheld resources to manipulate Brian and create artificial desperation. Stewie asks Brian why he keeps a gun in his safety deposit box. Brian eventually admits the gun was intended for suicide. He expresses that life is too much for him, that Stewie was right about him not living with purpose, and that he cannot find meaning in his life. The scotch Brian brought was planned as his last drink before killing himself. This confession transforms the entire episode because it reveals Brian keeps a suicide gun in his safety deposit box and actively contemplates ending his life. When Stewie asks if suicide was the reason for their visit to the bank, Brian reveals he actually came to deposit money in his Christmas account. This means Brian visited the bank for a mundane financial task while carrying the means and intention to potentially kill himself. Brian's suicidal ideation represents the episode's deepest, disturbing element because it reveals genuine mental health crisis rather than cartoon violence. Brian struggles with depression severe enough that he keeps a gun specifically for suicide and carries it with him during normal daily activities. His admission that he cannot find meaning or purpose in life shows existential despair. The fact that he brought scotch as a last drink before potential suicide indicates he has thought through the specifics of how he would end his life. Stewie's earlier comments about Brian having no purpose directly targeted Brian's deepest insecurity and suicidal thoughts, making Stewie's manipulation even more psychologically cruel. Stewie responds to Brian's confession by admitting that Brian is his only friend and means a lot to him. Stewie claims that Brian gives his life purpose, directly contradicting his earlier statements about Brian being purposeless and only useful for manipulation. This reversal shows Stewie attempting to repair the emotional damage he caused, but it also reveals how Stewie alternates between genuine affection and cruel manipulation. Stewie asks Brian to read to him, and Brian obliges. They fall asleep together, and when Stewie wakes, the vault opens. Brian carries Stewie out of the bank, ending their ordeal. The episode's structure as a bottle episode with only 2 characters in one location creates intense psychological pressure. Brian and Stewie cannot escape each other or the conversation topics that arise. This forced proximity strips away their usual defenses and social masks, revealing raw truths about their relationship and individual psychologies. The episode becomes a character study showing how desperation, intoxication, and prolonged isolation break down normal social boundaries and force uncomfortable honesty. The coprophagia scene generated significant controversy and discussion about how far Family Guy would go for shock value. Some viewers and critics argued the scene served no narrative purpose beyond disgusting audiences, while others claimed it demonstrated Brian's capacity for self-sacrifice or Stewie's manipulative nature. The scene certainly achieved notoriety, becoming one of Family Guy's most infamous moments. The decision to animate the act, rather than cutting away or leaving it to imagination, shows the creators wanted maximum impact and discomfort. Brian's suicidal ideation adds genuine darkness that transcends typical animated comedy. Suicide represents a real crisis affecting millions of people, and seeing a main character casually admit to keeping a suicide gun makes the show's fictional universe feel more psychologically realistic and troubling. The episode does not treat Brian's admission as a joke, but as a serious revelation about his mental state. However, the episode also does not provide any resolution to Brian's suicidal thoughts. The episode ends with Brian still possessing the gun and still struggling with depression and lack of purpose. This lack of resolution troubled mental health advocates who noted the episode raised serious issues without addressing them or showing Brian seeking help. Stewie's manipulation of Brian demonstrates emotional abuse patterns, where abusers alternate between affection and cruelty to maintain control. Stewie admits he forced Brian to eat feces just to see how far Brian would degrade himself, then later claims Brian is his only friend and gives his life meaning. This push-pull dynamic keeps Brian emotionally destabilized and dependent on Stewie's approval. The fact that Brian finds comfort in Stewie's final affectionate statements, despite the cruelty that preceded them, shows how effective this manipulation proves. The episode's musical montage ending feels jarring after the psychological intensity of the main story. After the vault scenes conclude, the show presents various musical numbers from past episodes, including the NAAFP anthem, songs from Business Guy, and others. Stewie then rants about the FCC liking their controversial song when it was supposed to make them think critically. This lighthearted ending attempts to reset the tone after the disturbing main episode, but the tonal whiplash proves unsettling rather than comforting. The lack of other characters throughout the episode creates an unusual viewing experience for Family Guy fans, accustomed to ensemble casts and multiple plot threads. The entire episode focuses solely on Brian and Stewie's relationship without cutaway gags to provide relief from the intensity. This stripped-down approach forces viewers to sit with the uncomfortable situations rather than being distracted by unrelated jokes. The episode becomes a test of how much psychological discomfort the audience can tolerate without the usual comedic safety valves. The vault setting creates a pressure cooker environment where characters cannot escape consequences of their actions or words. When Stewie wastes the phone battery, he must face Brian's anger directly. When Stewie admits to manipulating Brian, he must deal with Brian's response immediately. This accountability differs from typical episodes where characters can leave scenes or avoid confrontation. The vault forces both characters to work through conflicts because they have nowhere else to go. The episode explores themes of dependency and toxicity in relationships. Brian and Stewie clearly care about each other, but their relationship involves manipulation, cruelty, and power imbalances. Stewie uses his knowledge of Brian's vulnerabilities to hurt him deliberately, while Brian enables Stewie's worst behaviors and allows himself to be degraded. Neither character demonstrates healthy relationship skills, and their isolation in the vault magnifies these dysfunction patterns. The gun's presence throughout the episode creates constant danger. Brian and Stewie struggle over it, accidentally discharge it, and use it to threaten each other. The fact that Brian brought a loaded weapon to the bank shows incredibly poor judgment. His admission that the gun exists for suicide rather than protection adds dark context to every scene where it appears. The accidental discharge demonstrates how their careless handling of the weapon could have resulted in death, transforming their already desperate situation into a near tragedy. The episode received mixed reactions from critics and audiences. Some praised the ambitious single-location storytelling and character-focused narrative. Others criticized it for being gratuitously disturbing without sufficient payoff or meaning. The coprophagia scene in particular divided viewers between those who found it darkly funny and those who considered it purely disgusting without comedic value. The episode's departure from Family Guy's typical format made it a memorable experiment, but not necessarily an enjoyable viewing experience. From a character development perspective, the episode reveals important information about both Brian and Stewie's psychology. Brian's depression and suicidal ideation explain some of his self-destructive behaviors in other episodes. Stewie's manipulation shows a darker side to his genius, where he uses his intelligence to conduct psychological experiments on people he claims to love. These revelations add depth to both characters, but make them considerably less likable by exposing their capacity for cruelty and self-destruction. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Herpes the Love Sore. Herp the Love Sore. Family Guy Season 12, Episode 16, aired on the 6th of April 2014, with guest star Bryan Cranston, and became one of the show's most disturbing episodes by depicting an adult dog giving a toddler a sexually transmitted disease. Written by Andrew Goldberg and directed by Greg Colton, the episode centers on Brian infecting Stewie with herpes through a blood brothers ritual, then the revelation that Brian has been intentionally spreading the disease to multiple people. The episode treats a lifelong, incurable STD as a plot device for comedy, while showing a child dealing with the physical and social consequences of contracting herpes from someone he trusted completely. The episode begins with a subplot about Quagmire's mail being delivered to Peter's house. Peter opens the package to find a whip and proceeds to have fun with it around town, even visiting Cleveland. This lighthearted opening contrasts sharply with the main storyline's disturbing content about disease transmission. The whip subplot serves as comic relief throughout the episode, but feels disconnected from the serious implications of the Brian and Stewie storyline. The main plot begins with Brian watching television when Stewie arrives wanting to perform a blood brothers ritual. Brian explains how the ritual works, and Stewie insists on trying it with him. They cut their skin and share their blood, mixing it together in the traditional Blood Brothers ceremony. This moment represents Stewie seeking deeper bonding with Brian, treating the ritual as a meaningful friendship gesture. Stewie views Blood Brothers as a symbol of loyalty and trust, making what follows particularly devastating from a betrayal perspective. Stewie wakes up the next day and discovers he has a herpes sore. He angrily confronts Brian about giving him the disease. Brian initially insists there is no way he could be responsible for Stewie's herpes infection until Stewie proves otherwise. The episode does not specify how Stewie proves Brian's responsibility, but Brian eventually cannot deny that he transmitted the disease. Brian tries to dismiss Stewie's concerns rather than apologizing or taking responsibility for infecting a child with an incurable STD. This dismissive response shows Brian prioritizing his own comfort over the serious health consequences he inflicted on Stewie. Stewie experiences all sorts of problems with his personal contacts after contracting herpes. The visible sore on his face creates immediate social consequences because herpes carries significant stigma. Stewie tries to cover up the sore using some kind of disguise, but when his teacher removes the disguise, his infection becomes publicly known. This public exposure means Stewie faces social judgment and embarrassment as a young child dealing with an STD that most people associate with sexual activity. The fact that Stewie contracted herpes from a friendship ritual rather than sexual contact does not protect him from the social stigma attached to the disease. While Stewie confesses his situation to his stuffed bear Rupert, Chris overhears the conversation. Chris reveals that he also has herpes that Brian gave him and drops the bombshell that Brian spread the disease intentionally. This revelation transforms the episode from being about accidental disease transmission into something far more disturbing. Brian did not accidentally infect Stewie and Chris through ignorance of his own status. Brian knowingly carried herpes and deliberately transmitted it to others. The fact that Brian intentionally infected a toddler and a teenager with an incurable STD crosses into genuinely disturbing territory that goes beyond typical Family Guy dark comedy. The motivation behind Brian's intentional disease spreading remains unclear in the transcript. The episode does not explain why Brian would deliberately infect children with herpes. Possible interpretations include Brian wanting others to share his condition so he feels less alone, Brian acting out of cruelty, or Brian simply not caring about consequences of his actions. Regardless of motivation, intentionally infecting minors with STDs represents a form of assault that real legal systems prosecute as criminal behavior. The episode treats this serious crime as a relationship conflict rather than addressing the severity of Brian's actions. Brian goes out on a date with a girl, showing he continues pursuing romantic relationships despite knowingly carrying herpes and having a pattern of intentionally infecting others. Chris and Stewie decide to interfere with Brian's date, screwing up his chance with the girl to Brian's frustration. Their interference represents revenge for Brian infecting them and serves as their attempt to prevent Brian from potentially infecting another person. By sabotaging Brian's date, they protect his potential partner from the same fate they experienced. Brian discovers his Facebook account has been hacked and demands to know what Chris and Stewie want. The hacking represents another form of revenge and social consequences for Brian's actions. Chris takes off in Brian's car, escalating their retaliation campaign. Stewie then reveals the emotional core of his anger by stating that he cannot trust his best friend anymore. This statement shows how Brian's actions destroyed the foundation of their relationship. Stewie viewed Brian as his best friend and someone worthy of performing a blood brothers ritual with, symbolizing ultimate trust and loyalty. Brian violated that trust by infecting Stewie with a disease that will affect him for life. Brian finally apologizes and insists he will never lie again. This apology comes only after Chris and Stewie retaliate extensively rather than immediately after Stewie discovered the infection. Brian's delayed apology suggests he only feels remorse when facing consequences rather than genuine regret for harming people he claims to care about. The promise to never lie again also rings hollow because Brian's pattern of intentionally spreading disease shows a fundamental disregard for others' well-being. Brian explains that the herpes will likely only flare up when Stewie is stressed. The episode then shows a future scene where adult Stewie breaks out with herpes during a job interview. This flash forward demonstrates the lifelong impact of Brian's actions. Stewie will deal with recurring outbreaks during important life moments, with the disease affecting his professional opportunities, relationships, and self-confidence for decades. The job interview outbreak shows how the disease Brian gave Stewie as a toddler will still be causing problems when Stewie reaches adulthood and tries to build a career. The episode's treatment of herpes as a relatively minor inconvenience rather than a serious health issue troubled some viewers and medical professionals. While herpes is manageable with medication and many infected people live normal lives, the disease still carries significant social stigma and can cause painful outbreaks. Presenting herpes transmission to children as material for comedy potentially trivializes the real experiences of people living with the condition. The episode also does not address the psychological trauma of discovering someone you trusted deliberately infected you with an incurable disease. The subplot about Peter, Joe, and Quagmire losing their booth at the Drunken Clam provides contrast to the main storyline. The guys arrive at the bar to find their usual booth taken by three tough guys. When they approach to point out that the booth is their usual table, the tough guys announce plans to take it over permanently and tell the main characters they can no longer use it. Peter, Joe, and Quagmire sheepishly leave rather than fighting for their booth. Sitting at the bar instead, they find things just are not the same and admit they are cowards for not standing up to the tough guys. Their friends and family lose respect for them after learning about the booth situation. However, when Lois finds out what happened, she forces Peter to stand up for himself. Peter gathers the guys and Joe joins him to confront the tough guys, though Quagmire initially refuses to participate. When Peter and Joe confront the tough guys, Quagmire eventually joins in and they all fight. The fight goes badly for Peter's group as they start getting beaten up badly. Peter pulls out a can of spinach, apparently expecting it to give him super strength like Popeye, but the spinach does not work as Peter expected. Despite taking another punch, Peter refuses to give up and explains the significance of the booth to them. The tough guys reveal that fighting over the booth is not worth it because they are shipping out to Afghanistan the following day. This revelation reframes the entire conflict because the tough guys are military service members about to deploy to a war zone. They get hailed as heroes, while Peter, Joe, and Quagmire still fail to gain any respect despite attempting to fight for their booth. This subplot resolution suggests that military service earns respect, while fighting over bar seating does not, though the connection to the main Herpes storyline remains unclear. The episode's structure, splitting time between a serious disease transmission plot and a comedic bar booth conflict, creates tonal inconsistency. The Herpes storyline deals with betrayal, lifelong health consequences, and violation of trust between best friends. The Booth storyline involves silly territorial disputes and misguided attempts at masculinity. These plotlines do not complement each other thematically, and the Booth story feels like filler, preventing the episode from fully exploring the disturbing implications of Brian intentionally infecting children with STDs. From a character development perspective, the episode reveals deeply troubling aspects of Brian's personality. Previous episodes established Brian as flawed, pretentious, and self-centered, but intentionally spreading disease to children crosses into territory that makes the character irredeemable for many viewers. The episode does not provide sufficient consequences for Brian's actions. He faces temporary inconvenience from Chris and Stewie's revenge, but suffers no legal consequences, social ostracism, or lasting damage to his relationships. The episode ends with apparent reconciliation, rather than Brian facing appropriate accountability. Stewie's character suffers permanent consequences from this episode. He now lives with a lifelong disease that will cause recurring outbreaks during stressful moments throughout his life. The future job interview scene shows this is not a problem that resolves or becomes irrelevant. Stewie will deal with physical symptoms and social stigma associated with herpes for his entire life because Brian decided to perform a blood brothers ritual while knowingly infected with an STD. The episode treats this as resolved once Brian apologizes, but real consequences will persist for Stewie indefinitely. Chris's revelation that Brian also intentionally infected him raises questions the episode never answers. How long has Chris had herpes? How did Brian infect Chris? Has Brian infected other people beyond Stewie and Chris? The episode presents Brian as having a pattern of intentional disease transmission, but does not explore the full scope of his actions. This incomplete storytelling leaves disturbing implications hanging without resolution. The episode's use of Bryan Cranston as a guest star seems disconnected from the main plot. The transcript does not specify which character Cranston voices or how that character relates to either the Herpes storyline or the Booth storyline. Guest stars typically receive prominent roles, but the transcript provides no information about Cranston's contribution to this particular episode. The Blood Brothers ritual itself becomes tainted by the episode's events. Blood Brothers ceremonies symbolize deep friendship and loyalty, with the blood mixing representing permanent bonding. Brian corrupted this meaningful ritual by using it as a method to infect Stewie. This corruption means Stewie cannot look back on the Blood Brothers ceremony as a positive memory of bonding with his best friend. Instead, it becomes the moment Brian betrayed him and sentenced him to lifelong disease management. The episode generated controversy among viewers and critics who felt it went too far, even by Family Guy standards. Depicting deliberate STD transmission to children struck many as crossing a line from dark comedy into content that trivializes serious harm. Medical professionals noted that intentionally infecting someone with an STD constitutes assault in many jurisdictions, and the episode's light treatment of Brian's actions sends problematic messages about disease transmission and accountability. Some viewers defended the episode as satirizing how people handle STD disclosure and the social stigma around herpes. Supporters argued the episode highlighted real issues around disease stigma by showing Stewie's social struggles after infection. However, critics countered that using a toddler as the vehicle for this satire undermined any legitimate social commentary by making the situation too absurd and disturbing to extract meaningful messages about real STD stigma issues. The episode's ending lacks meaningful resolution to the central conflict. Brian apologizes and promises not to lie anymore, but faces no consequences beyond temporary inconvenience. Stewie and Chris apparently accept his apology, despite Brian deliberately infecting them with an incurable disease. The relationship between Brian and Stewie returns to normal rather than permanently changing based on the severity of Brian's betrayal. This consequence-free resolution troubled viewers who felt the episode raised serious issues, then dismissed them without appropriate weight. The flash forward to adult Stewie's job interview serves as the episode's only acknowledgement of lasting consequences. This single scene shows the herpes will continue affecting Stewie's life decades later, but the episode does not dwell on this impact or show Stewie struggling with long-term effects beyond one outbreak. The brief flash forward feels insufficient given the permanent life alteration Brian imposed on Stewie. The episode represents Family Guy's tendency to use shocking content for attention without fully exploring the implications of that content. By having Brian intentionally infect children with STDs, the show created an inherently disturbing premise. However, the execution treats this premise as a temporary relationship conflict rather than the serious violation it represents. The episode wants credit for being edgy and controversial without committing to the dramatic weight such content deserves. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to A Shot in the Dark. A Shot in the Dark. Family Guy, Season 14, Episode 9, aired on the 13th of December 2015 and became one of the show's most controversial episodes by tackling police shootings of black individuals, systemic racism, and media manipulation of racial violence. Written by Mike Desilets and directed by Brian Iles, the episode centers on Peter Griffin accidentally shooting Cleveland Brown Jr. and the subsequent accusations of racial motivation that tear apart their friendship and community. The episode attempts to satirize real-world discussions about police brutality and racial profiling, but sparked intense debate about whether the show handled such sensitive subject matter appropriately or trivialized serious issues affecting black communities. The episode begins with Peter having his couch outside the house where he and his friends do their drinking. When someone takes the couch, the group decides to form a neighborhood community watch program. Joe Swanson, being a police officer, explains that community watch members cannot carry guns legally. Despite this clear explanation from someone with law enforcement authority, Peter manages to obtain several guns anyway. This immediately establishes that Peter will be operating outside legal boundaries and proper community watch protocols, setting up the dangerous situation that follows. While on watch duty, armed with his illegally obtained weapons, Peter spots a shadowy figure entering Cleveland's house. Without attempting to identify the person, call out to them, or assess whether any actual crime is occurring, Peter shoots at the figure. The person Peter shoots is Cleveland Brown Jr., Cleveland's teenage son who was simply returning to his own home. This shooting of an unarmed black teenager entering his own house by a white man with a gun immediately invokes real-world tragedies where black individuals have been killed in similar circumstances. The episode deliberately parallels cases like those of Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Renisha McBride, and countless other black people killed by armed civilians who perceived them as threats based on racial bias. Peter rushes to the hospital where he meets the Brown family. Cleveland and his wife Donna are extremely upset with Peter, considering him racist for shooting their son. Cleveland Jr. explains that he did not hear Peter approach or call out because he was listening to music through headphones. This detail emphasizes that Jr. had no way to respond to any warnings Peter may have given and was completely unaware of Peter's presence. The headphones also connect to real cases like Jordan Davis, who was killed while sitting in a car playing music. Joe tries to explain that the police have investigated and considered the shooting an accident rather than a crime. However, Cleveland refuses to accept this explanation and wants nothing further to do with Peter. Cleveland's rejection of the police department's accident ruling reflects real frustrations in black communities, where police investigations often decline to charge white civilians or officers who kill black people. The episode shows Cleveland going on television to publicly pressure the city of Quahog to consider the shooting a hate crime. By taking his case to the media, Cleveland bypasses the police department he views as protecting Peter and appeals directly to public opinion. This media strategy mirrors real activists who use television, social media, and protests to demand accountability when they believe legal systems have failed. The Griffin family becomes pariahs in their community after Cleveland's television appearance. Public opinion turns against them, and they face social consequences for Peter's actions. Peter decides he must prove he is not racist, though his subsequent actions demonstrate he fundamentally misunderstands both his offense and how to make amends. Peter tries to bring Cleveland a drink and cigars as an apology gift, but Cleveland rebuffs this gesture. During this rejected peace offering, Peter's clumsiness results in Cleveland's house catching on fire. The fact that Peter accidentally sets Cleveland's home ablaze while attempting to apologize adds another layer of harm to the family, Peter already hurt by shooting their son. As a crowd gathers around the burning house, Peter screams for the Brown family to get out of the burning home. However, the crowd misconstrues Peter's screams as threats rather than warnings. This miscommunication shows how Peter's previous actions have destroyed any benefit of the doubt he might have received. The community now interprets Peter's behavior through the lens of having shot Cleveland Jr., so even genuine concern for the family's safety gets read as aggression. Joe is forced to arrest Peter based on orders from his supervisors, who want to pacify the black community. This detail suggests the police department is performing accountability for public relations purposes rather than genuine justice, since they previously ruled the shooting accidental, but now arrest Peter only after community pressure intensifies. While Peter sits in jail, Carter Pewterschmidt arrives and offers his help. Carter proposes bailing Peter out and providing a distraction for the community. As a wealthy and powerful figure, Carter can access resources and legal representation that average people cannot. His involvement introduces class dynamics into the racial conflict, showing how wealth provides protection from consequences. The courtroom scene becomes one of the episode's most disturbing moments because it demonstrates how legal systems can manipulate racial narratives to defend white defendants. During court proceedings, Cleveland Jr. gives testimony that reduces the courtroom to tears. The transcript does not specify the exact content of Jr.'s testimony, but his emotional impact suggests he described the trauma of being shot while simply returning home, the pain of his injuries, and the violation of feeling unsafe in his own neighborhood. However, Carter's lawyer immediately begins attacking Jr.'s character. The lawyer focuses on Jr.'s music choice, suggesting that listening to certain types of music makes Jr. a thug. This character assassination tactic reflects real defense strategies in cases involving black victims, where lawyers introduce irrelevant details about clothing, music preferences, school disciplinary records, or social media posts to suggest the victim somehow deserved their fate. Peter objects to this character assassination of Cleveland Jr., showing that even Peter recognizes the lawyer has crossed a line. However, the lawyer continues by tricking Jr. into taking a knife. The lawyer then uses Jr.'s possession of the knife to make him appear threatening to the jury, despite the fact that the lawyer provided the knife specifically to create this false impression. This courtroom manipulation demonstrates how legal proceedings can be staged to justify violence against black people by constructing narratives of threat that did not exist during the actual incident. Jr. never had a weapon when Peter shot him, but the courtroom scene creates the false impression that Jr. poses danger. Outside the courtroom, Cleveland confronts Peter and insists their friendship is over. This represents Cleveland drawing a firm boundary and prioritizing his family's safety and dignity over his relationship with Peter. Cleveland's willingness to end their longtime friendship shows the severity of Peter's offense and the fundamental trust violation involved in shooting his son. The friendship cannot continue because Peter's actions revealed either racist assumptions or such extreme recklessness that the distinction becomes irrelevant from Cleveland's perspective. The situation escalates when a mob turns on Cleveland and his family outside their home. The crowd's hostility toward the Brown family demonstrates how quickly public opinion can shift and how black victims often face blame for the violence committed against them. Peter intercedes by admitting publicly that he shot Cleveland Jr. This admission protects the Brown family from the mob's anger by refocusing attention on Peter as the shooter. Cleveland is touched by Peter's willingness to face consequences and protect his family. In response, Cleveland claims he shot Jr. himself, which causes the crowd to immediately lose interest. The crowd's instant disengagement when the shooting becomes classified as black-on-black crime rather than interracial violence serves as the episode's sharpest social commentary. This moment satirizes how media coverage and public attention differ dramatically based on whether violence is interracial or intraracial. The episode suggests that society pays intense attention to white-on-black violence, but largely ignores black-on-black crime, even though the victim's suffering remains identical regardless of the shooter's race. This commentary reflects real patterns in news coverage and activism, where certain cases receive massive attention while others go largely unreported. However, the episode's execution of this point troubled many viewers who felt it dismissed legitimate concerns about racially motivated violence by equating it with other types of community violence. Cleveland admits he realized Peter only shot Jr. due to stupidity rather than racism. This conclusion resolves their friendship conflict by attributing Peter's actions to his characteristic incompetence rather than racial bias. However, this resolution troubled critics who noted that the outcome of the shooting remains the same regardless of Peter's internal motivations. Cleveland Jr. suffered a gunshot wound, whether Peter acted from racism or stupidity. The episode suggests that Peter's lack of conscious racial animus absolves him of responsibility, but real discussions about systemic racism emphasize how unconscious bias and reckless behavior that disproportionately harms black people still constitute racism regardless of conscious intent. Peter apologizes to Cleveland Jr., and Jr. accepts the apology. However, after Cleveland leaves the room, Jr. threatens Peter in an ambiguous way. He then laughs it off and leaves Peter uncertain whether the threat was serious or joking. This final interaction adds tension by suggesting Jr. may harbor genuine anger beneath his acceptance of Peter's apology. The ambiguity leaves viewers and Peter unsure whether Jr. has truly forgiven Peter or simply performed forgiveness while his father was present. The episode generated massive controversy from multiple perspectives. Many black viewers and critics argued the episode trivialized the serious issue of white civilians killing unarmed black people by making it about Peter's stupidity rather than addressing systemic racism and the devaluation of black lives. The resolution where Cleveland and Peter reconcile after Cleveland dismisses racism as a factor felt like the show prioritizing white comfort over accurately depicting the lasting trauma. Such incidents cause black families and communities. Some viewers appreciated the episode's attempt to satirize media coverage patterns and legal system manipulation of racial narratives. Supporters argued the courtroom scene effectively demonstrated how defense attorneys construct false threatening narratives about black victims. The crowd's instant disinterest when the shooting became classified as black-on-black crime highlighted real media bias in coverage patterns. However, critics countered that these satirical elements got undermined by the episode's conclusion that Peter was not actually racist, which suggested the systemic issues highlighted earlier were not truly relevant to this specific case. The episode's release timing in December 2015 came during heightened national discussion about police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement. The 2014 killings of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, the 2015 killing of Freddie Gray, and numerous other high-profile cases had sparked massive protests and intense debate about racism in American policing and society. Family Guy, entering this conversation with an episode that concluded the white shooter was just stupid rather than racist, struck many as tone-deaf given the real families grieving loved ones killed in similar circumstances. The character of Cleveland Jr. particularly troubled viewers because the episode shows a black teenager getting shot while entering his own home, suffering the trauma of that experience, enduring character assassination in court that portrays him as a thug, watching his shooter face minimal consequences, and then expected to forgive and move forward. This narrative mirrors what many Black families experience in real life when their loved ones are killed and the legal system fails to provide justice. Using these real traumas as material for a comedy episode felt exploitative to many viewers. Peter's characterization in the episode demonstrates dangerous behavior patterns that the show ultimately excuses as stupidity. Peter illegally obtained guns, despite being told by a police officer that community watch members cannot carry weapons. He shot at a shadowy figure without properly identifying a threat or attempting non-violent intervention. His apology attempts caused additional property damage. The episode frames these failures as Peter being Peter, rather than addressing how his specific actions endangered the Brown family. This framing troubled critics who noted that stupidity does not justify or excuse shooting an unarmed teenager. Joe Swanson's role as a police officer forced to arrest Peter based on supervisor orders rather than his own judgment highlights issues with police accountability and political pressure. Joe initially investigated and deemed the shooting accidental, but arrested Peter later when ordered to do so for community relations purposes. This suggests the police department's actions respond to public pressure rather than consistent application of law, which could be read as either critique of police inconsistency or suggestion that accountability measures only happen due to political correctness rather than genuine justice concerns. Carter Pewterschmidt's involvement introduces wealth inequality into the racial dynamics. Carter provides Peter with expensive legal representation that constructs a defense strategy based on attacking Cleveland Jr.'s character. This demonstrates how wealth buys access to sophisticated legal tactics unavailable to average defendants, and how those tactics can manipulate racial stereotypes to defend white clients. The episode shows this manipulation working successfully, with Peter facing minimal consequences despite shooting someone. The community watch premise itself invokes Trayvon Martin's killing by George Zimmerman, who shot the unarmed teenager while serving as neighborhood watch coordinator. The similarities are unmistakable. Armed civilian conducting neighborhood watch, Black teenager in his own neighborhood, shooting based on perceived threat, legal system declining to prosecute. Family Guy's decision to recreate this scenario as comedy material felt inappropriate to many viewers, still processing the real Martin case and similar tragedies. Cleveland's willingness to reconcile with Peter after declaring their friendship over troubled viewers, who felt it represented Black characters forgiving white characters too easily. The episode shows Cleveland initially taking a firm stand and demanding accountability, but ultimately deciding Peter's stupidity rather than racism motivated the shooting. This softening allows the white protagonist to maintain his friendship and face minimal lasting consequences. Critics noted this pattern appears frequently in media, where Black characters must forgive white characters who harm them to restore narrative harmony and white audience comfort. The episode's handling of racial profiling and unconscious bias remains inadequate, according to many critics. Peter shot Cleveland Jr. because he perceived a shadowy figure as threatening enough to shoot without proper identification. The question of why Peter made that threat assessment and whether Jr.'s race influenced that snap judgment never gets seriously explored. The episode concludes Peter was not racist without examining whether unconscious racial bias influenced his actions, even without conscious racist intent. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Fresh Air. Fresh Air. Family Guy Season 12, Episode 14 aired on the 23rd of March 2014 and became one of the show's most disturbing episodes by depicting a father proposing marriage to his teenage son. Written by Steve Callahan and directed by Mike Kim, the episode centers on Peter Griffin attempting to marry Chris Griffin in order to gain access to the family fortune that Carter Pewterschmidt plans to leave to Chris. The episode treats incestuous marriage between a parent and child as comedy material while exploring themes of parental neglect, emotional manipulation, and a child's desperate attempts to receive attention from an absent father. The episode begins with Chris wanting to spend time with Peter, but Peter blows him off completely. This establishes the core problem driving the entire episode, which is Peter's chronic neglect of his son and unwillingness to invest time in their relationship. Chris seeks basic father-son bonding, but Peter cannot be bothered to give his teenage son attention. This parental neglect represents emotional abuse that creates the vulnerability Peter later exploits when he needs something from Chris. The episode shows how parents who withhold affection create situations where children become willing to accept inappropriate behavior just to receive the attention they crave. Carter Pewterschmidt breaks his leg at the mall, creating a situation where someone needs to care for him. Barbara Pewterschmidt needs to go out of town and cannot provide the care herself. Lois also cannot take care of Carter, and when Meg turns down the responsibility, Chris gets stuck with the job. However, Chris and Carter unexpectedly hit it off during their time together. Carter appreciates Chris's company and genuine care, leading him to make a significant decision. Carter decides to make Chris the sole heir to the Pewterschmidt family fortune, cutting out other potential inheritors, including his own daughter Lois and grandson-in-law Peter. Chris shows reluctance to accept the money, which makes him even more appealing in Carter's eyes. Carter values Chris's humility and lack of greed, seeing these qualities as evidence that Chris deserves the inheritance. The irony is that Chris's reluctance to take money he did not earn demonstrates the character traits that should disqualify someone from receiving unearned wealth in the first place. Carter's appreciation for Chris's modesty reveals that Carter recognizes most people in his family want his money for selfish reasons, making Chris's disinterest refreshing by contrast. Peter becomes extremely upset when he learns Carter wants to leave the money to Chris instead of through Lois to Peter. Peter's reaction is purely financial rather than emotional. He does not celebrate his son forming a meaningful relationship with his grandfather or Chris being recognized for his kindness. Peter only cares that the money will go to Chris rather than being accessible to Peter. This reveals Peter's relationship with his son is transactional rather than loving. Peter vows to suck up to Chris to get closer to the money, showing he will manipulate his own child for financial gain. Peter begins trying to ingratiate himself with Chris by dressing like a teenager and pandering to typical adolescent interests. Peter attempts to become Chris's friend rather than his father, hoping this will give him influence over Chris's eventual inheritance decisions. When this strategy fails to work, Peter engages in a series of stunts designed to impress Chris or gain his favor. The transcript notes these stunts fail, meaning Peter's attempts to bond with Chris through spectacle rather than genuine relationship building do not succeed. Peter's approach demonstrates he fundamentally misunderstands what Chris actually wants, which is simply his father's time and attention rather than performances or grand gestures. At the Drunken Clam, Peter's friends note he looks exhausted from his efforts to win Chris over. The guys express feeling happy for Chris, hoping that whatever girl or guy Chris meets makes him happy. This comment from Peter's friends gives Peter an idea that becomes the episode's most disturbing element. Peter decides to propose marriage to Chris. The friends' comment about Chris potentially being in a relationship with a girl or guy was meant as casual acceptance of any romantic partner Chris might have, but Peter interprets it as suggesting he could marry Chris himself. Peter proposes a Vermont gay marriage to Chris that same night. Vermont legalized same-sex marriage in 2009, making it one of the early states to do so. Peter exploits Vermont's marriage equality laws to pursue a legal marriage with his own son. The fact that Peter frames this as a gay marriage rather than acknowledging it as incestuous marriage shows how he deliberately misrepresents the situation. The issue is not that Peter and Chris are both male, but that they are parent and child. Peter uses the language of marriage equality to obscure that he is proposing incest. Peter reveals he convinced Lois to sign divorce papers, meaning Peter has already legally dissolved his marriage to Lois before proposing to Chris. The episode does not explain how Peter got Lois to sign these papers or whether she understood what she was signing. Peter's willingness to divorce his wife of many years to marry his teenage son demonstrates how far he will go to access Carter's money. Peter destroys his marriage and attempts to enter an incestuous relationship with his child purely for financial gain. Chris decides to pursue the wedding in order to force Peter to spend time with him. This reveals the devastating extent of Peter's parental neglect and Chris's desperation for attention. Chris is so starved for his father's time and affection that he agrees to marry Peter just because wedding planning requires them to interact. Chris recognizes that Peter's motivation is financial manipulation, but Chris values any time with his father so highly that he accepts the inappropriate conditions under which that time is offered. This shows profoundly unhealthy relationship dynamics, where a neglected child will accept abuse or exploitation just to receive scraps of parental attention. As they drive to Vermont, Chris mentions all the preparations they need to make, including the gift registry and reception dance. Chris engages enthusiastically with wedding planning details, treating the journey as genuine quality time with his father. The fact that Chris discusses gift registries and reception dances for his wedding to his own father shows how the episode fully commits to the disturbing premise rather than keeping it abstract. Chris planning what gifts he and Peter will receive as a married couple and what song they will dance to at their wedding reception forces viewers to confront the concrete reality of a parent-child marriage rather than treating it as concrete marriage to Jenna. A vague concept. On the wedding day, a ceremony is actually taking place, with Chris and Peter preparing to legally marry. The episode does not show them arriving in Vermont, finding an officiant willing to marry them, or obtaining a marriage license. These logistical details get skipped over, but the fact that they reach the point of an actual ceremony shows they successfully navigated whatever legal requirements exist. The ceremony proceeds far enough that vows are presumably being exchanged before anyone interrupts. Lois interrupts the ceremony to tell Peter he is doing wrong. Lois's intervention comes extremely late, given she apparently signed divorce papers and allowed Peter and Chris to travel to Vermont and arrange a wedding. Her decision to stop the ceremony only at the last possible moment, rather than preventing it from happening in the first place, shows she initially failed to protect her son from his father's exploitation. Lois should have refused to divorce Peter, contacted authorities about Peter attempting to marry their child, or taken other protective action much earlier in this process. Chris stops Lois from continuing her speech to Peter. Instead of allowing Lois to explain why the marriage is wrong, Chris takes over the conversation. Chris tells Lois about having fun, spending time with his dad during the wedding planning process. This reveals that the journey to Vermont and the wedding preparations gave Chris the father-son bonding he originally wanted when the episode began. Chris reveals he knew all along that Peter's motivation was accessing the inheritance money rather than genuine desire to marry Chris. This means Chris consciously participated in an incestuous marriage plan while fully aware he was being manipulated, simply because it was the only way to get his father's attention. Chris and Peter agree to settle for being father and son, which resolves the marriage plot. They return home together, presumably with Peter still divorced from Lois, based on the signed papers mentioned earlier. The episode ends with apparent reconciliation, where Peter and Chris have a better relationship after this experience. However, the resolution does not address the serious issues raised by Peter's willingness to marry his child or Chris's willingness to accept inappropriate relationships to gain parental attention. The episode generated significant controversy for its central premise of father-son marriage. Many viewers found the concept inherently disturbing, regardless of how the show executed it. The idea of a parent proposing marriage to their child crosses fundamental taboos that exist across virtually all cultures. Marriage between parents and children is illegal everywhere, considered incestuous abuse, and recognized as harmful to the child, regardless of the child's apparent consent. The episode's treatment of this concept as comedy material troubled many viewers who felt certain subjects should remain off-limits, even for shows known for pushing boundaries. The episode's use of Vermont's same-sex marriage laws as the mechanism enabling Peter's plan generated particular criticism. Marriage equality advocates noted that the episode associated same-sex marriage with incest, playing into harmful stereotypes used by opponents of marriage equality. The episode aired in 2014, when same-sex marriage remained illegal in many states and was still subject to intense political and legal battles. Using marriage equality laws as a plot device for incestuous marriage felt like the show undermining the legitimacy of same-sex marriage by connecting it to universally condemned incest. The grooming dynamics present in the episode troubled child safety advocates. Peter uses his parental authority and Chris's desperate need for attention to manipulate Chris into agreeing to marriage. Even though Chris reveals he knew Peter's motivation, this does not negate the manipulation. Chris is a minor or barely adult, depending on his age in this episode, and Peter is his father with inherent power over him. The relationship dynamics make genuine consent impossible because Chris cannot freely refuse Peter without losing the parental attention he desperately needs. This mirrors real grooming situations where adults exploit children's emotional needs to gain compliance with inappropriate activities. Chris's characterization in the episode demonstrates the psychological damage caused by parental neglect. Chris wants such basic interaction with his father that he will accept being used as a tool to access money. He will agree to marry his own father just to spend time together during wedding planning. This extreme behavior shows Chris has been so consistently denied normal parent-child bonding that he no longer recognizes or demands appropriate boundaries. Children who grow up with severe emotional neglect often develop distorted understanding of relationships where they believe they must accept mistreatment to receive any affection. Peter's characterization reveals him as willing to commit incest and destroy his marriage for money. The episode presents this as extreme selfishness rather than Peter having any genuine attraction to Chris or desire for an actual romantic relationship with his son. Peter views marrying Chris purely as a financial transaction that will give him legal claim to Chris's inheritance. This instrumental treatment of his own child as a means to wealth shows Peter's complete moral bankruptcy. He will exploit his son's emotional vulnerability and violate fundamental parent-child boundaries without hesitation when money is involved. The episode's resolution, where Chris and Peter reconcile and return to being father and son, does not provide genuine consequences for Peter's actions. Peter attempted to marry his child, divorced his wife, and manipulated his son's emotional needs for financial gain. Yet the episode ends with their relationship apparently improved rather than Peter facing any accountability. This consequence-free resolution troubled viewers who felt the episode raised serious issues about parental exploitation, but resolved them with a simple agreement to be father and son instead. Peter should face consequences for his willingness to commit incest and his chronic neglect of Chris. But instead, the episode treats the entire situation as a learning experience that strengthens their bond. Lois's role in the episode also raised concerns. She apparently signed divorce papers without fully understanding or preventing Peter's plan to marry Chris. Her late intervention at the wedding ceremony, rather than earlier protection of Chris from his father's manipulation, shows Lois failing in her parental duty. As Chris's mother, Lois should have taken immediate action to stop Peter's plan, including refusing divorce, contacting authorities, or physically preventing Chris from traveling to Vermont. Her passive approach until the ceremony itself suggests she either did not take the situation seriously or felt unable to effectively oppose Peter. Carter's decision to make Chris his sole heir creates the financial incentive driving Peter's behavior, but the episode does not show Carter facing consequences for creating this situation. Carter presumably knows about Peter's plan to marry Chris to access the money, yet the transcript provides no information about Carter's response. Carter could revoke the inheritance, add conditions preventing Peter from accessing it, or take other protective action on Chris's behalf. The absence of Carter's response suggests he may not even know about the marriage attempt or may not care enough to intervene. The episode's treatment of marriage as a purely legal arrangement rather than a romantic or sexual relationship attempts to make the father-son marriage less disturbing, but this framing fails to address the fundamental wrongness. Peter and Chris are not portrayed as having romantic feelings for each other, which the episode seemingly presents as making the situation more acceptable. However, marriage between parent and child is harmful regardless of whether romantic or sexual elements are present. The legal and social bonds created by marriage are inappropriate between parent and child even in the absence of romance. The episode's suggestion that a sexless or romance-free parent-child marriage might be acceptable shows a fundamental misunderstanding of why incestuous relationships are harmful. The comedy derived from the episode relies on the absurdity of the premise rather than finding genuine humor in the situation. The episode presents a father marrying his son as shocking and outrageous, banking on audience discomfort to generate laughs. However, this approach to comedy troubled many viewers who felt incest should not be mined for humor, regardless of execution. The episode's commitment to showing actual wedding planning, a ceremony, and Chris discussing gift registries forces viewers to confront detailed reality of the incestuous marriage rather than keeping it abstract, which increased discomfort rather than comedy for many audience members. The episode raises questions about Vermont's marriage laws and whether officials would actually allow a parent and child to marry. In reality, all states prohibit parent-child marriage regardless of the ages or genders involved. Vermont's same-sex marriage law did not override existing prohibitions on incestuous marriage. The episode creates a fictional loophole where same-sex marriage laws supposedly allow relationships that would otherwise be prohibited, but this does not reflect actual legal reality. This fictional framing potentially confuses viewers about what marriage equality actually allows and reinforces false claims by marriage equality opponents who suggested allowing same-sex marriage would lead to legalizing other auspicious relationship types. The episode's airing in 2014 came during a specific moment in marriage equality history. The Supreme Court would not rule on nationwide marriage equality until 2015 inches, Obergefell v. Hodges. Many states still had same-sex marriage bans being challenged in courts. The cultural conversation about marriage equality remained intense, with strong opinions on both sides. Family Guy's decision to connect same-sex marriage with incest during this sensitive period struck many as irresponsible regardless of the show's intent. The episode provided ammunition for bad faith arguments against marriage equality by literally showing characters using same-sex marriage laws to pursue incestuous relationships. From a child welfare perspective, the episode depicts child exploitation without adequate condemnation or consequences. Peter exploits Chris's emotional needs to manipulate him into an inappropriate legal relationship. Even though Chris reveals he was aware of Peter's motivations, this awareness does not negate the exploitation. Children cannot consent to being exploited by parents, even if they understand what is happening, because the power imbalance makes genuine free choice impossible. The episode needed to show Peter facing serious consequences for attempting to marry his child, but instead provides a happy ending where father and son bond. The episode's message about parent-child relationships proves troubling upon examination. The takeaway seems to be that Chris got what he wanted, which was time with his father, even though the method required agreeing to marry Peter. This suggests children should accept inappropriate conditions to receive parental attention rather than parents having unconditional responsibility to provide appropriate care. The healthier message would show Peter learning he must give Chris attention freely without Chris needing to accept manipulation or exploitation. Instead, the episode validates Chris's willingness to accept inappropriate terms for basic parental interaction. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to The Hand That Rocks the Wheelchair. The Hand That Rocks the Wheelchair. Family Guy, Season 9, Episode 12, aired on the 6th of March, 2011, with guest star Patrick Stewart, and became one of the show's most disturbing episodes by depicting a teenage girl's obsessive attraction to a married adult man that escalates to criminal behavior and self-harm. Written by Tom Devaney and directed by Brian Iles, the episode centers on Meg Griffin developing romantic feelings for Joe Swanson after being asked to care for him and his infant daughter, then attempting to frame his wife for a crime and deliberately trying to paralyze herself to become more appealing to him. The episode treats stalking, attempted false imprisonment, and self-harm as comedy material, while showing how quickly caregiving relationships can become inappropriately twisted when one party develops unrequited romantic feelings. The episode begins with Bonnie Swanson asking Lois to check on Joe and their baby daughter Susie while Bonnie visits her father in the hospital. Lois passes this responsibility off to Meg rather than handling it herself, This delegation sets up the entire disturbing storyline because Meg, a socially isolated teenager desperate for attention and validation, gets placed in a caregiving role with an adult man. The arrangement initially goes well, with Meg apparently providing adequate care for Joe and Susie. However, Meg begins developing inappropriate feelings when Joe is not ashamed to drop her off in front of her school. This seemingly minor act of Joe treating Meg normally rather than hiding their association triggers romantic attachment in Meg. The fact that Joe simply dropping Meg off at school without embarrassment causes her to develop attraction demonstrates how starved Meg is for basic human kindness. Joe's willingness to be seen with Meg publicly represents more positive attention than Meg typically receives from anyone, including her own family. This basic decency, which should be the minimum standard for human interaction, becomes so meaningful to Meg that she interprets it as romantic interest. This shows how the Griffin family's constant mistreatment of Meg has damaged her ability to interpret normal friendly behavior versus romantic attraction. Meg begins pushing boundaries by calling Joe by his first name rather than using his last name or a title like Mr. Swanson. When Joe does not correct this informal address, Meg takes his silence as acceptance and escalates her boundary violations. She starts wearing Bonnie's dresses, which represents multiple violations. Meg is accessing Bonnie's personal belongings without permission, wearing another woman's clothing, and symbolically trying to take Bonnie's place as Joe's partner. The dress wearing shows Meg fantasizing about being Joe's wife and attempting to physically embody that fantasy by literally wearing his wife's clothes. When Meg discovers that Bonnie will be returning home from the hospital soon, she panics about losing access to Joe. Rather than accepting that her caregiving role was temporary, Meg decides to prevent Bonnie's return through criminal means. Meg steals Joe's service weapon, which is itself a serious crime, given that police firearms are strictly controlled. She then travels to Maine, where Bonnie is visiting her father. Meg plants Joe's gun in Bonnie's luggage, creating a situation where airport security will discover the weapon during screening. This plan succeeds, and Bonnie gets arrested at the airport for attempting to transport a firearm. Meg's plot to frame Bonnie represents attempted false imprisonment and evidence tampering, both serious felonies. Meg deliberately tried to get an innocent woman arrested and potentially imprisoned so she could continue spending time with that woman's husband. The episode treats this criminal conspiracy as a teenage crush gone too far, rather than addressing the severity of trying to destroy someone's life through false criminal charges. Real people have been imprisoned for years based on planted evidence, and Meg's actions could have resulted in Bonnie losing custody of Susie, losing her freedom, and acquiring a criminal record that would affect her permanently. With Bonnie arrested and unable to return home, Meg continues spending time with Joe. During an evening out for dinner, Meg begins talking about having children with Joe. This conversation shows Meg has developed elaborate fantasies about a future life with Joe, including having his children. For a teenage girl to discuss procreation with a married adult man represents completely inappropriate boundary violations. Joe appears uncomfortable during this conversation, but Meg becomes increasingly emotional as she discusses their imaginary future together. The dinner scene culminates with Meg breastfeeding Susie, Joe's infant daughter. The breastfeeding moment represents one of the episode's most disturbing elements. Meg is not Susie's mother, is not lactating, and has no appropriate reason to put an infant to her breast. The act serves no caregiving purpose since Meg cannot produce milk. Instead, Meg is using Joe's baby to act out maternal fantasies and demonstrate to Joe that she could fulfill a wife and mother role in his life. The episode animates this scene rather than leaving it off screen, forcing viewers to see Meg with Joe's infant at her breast. This inappropriate interaction with a baby as part of pursuing the baby's father crosses serious boundaries regarding both Joe and his daughter. Joe finally recognizes the severity of Meg's attraction and takes his concerns to Lois and Peter. He explains that Meg is becoming too attached to him in inappropriate ways. However, Lois and Peter dismiss Joe's concerns rather than taking them seriously. Their dismissal shows the Griffin parents' consistent pattern of ignoring serious issues affecting their daughter. Lois only takes the situation seriously when she personally witnesses Meg's attraction to Joe firsthand. Lois then confronts Meg and points out that Meg and Joe have nothing in common, attempting to break through Meg's romantic fantasies with reality. Rather than accepting that a relationship with Joe is impossible and inappropriate, Meg agrees with Lois that she and Joe have nothing in common, then immediately decides to solve this problem by becoming paralyzed like Joe. Meg throws herself in front of Joe's moving police squad car, deliberately attempting to get hit by the vehicle to sustain injuries that would paralyze her. This represents attempted self-harm motivated by obsessive romantic fixation. Meg is willing to permanently disable herself and destroy her own physical mobility to become more similar to the object of her obsession. The self-harm through attempted paralysis demonstrates how far Meg's mental state has deteriorated. She views becoming disabled not as a tragic loss of physical function, but as a way to gain romantic access to Joe. This shows Meg has completely lost perspective on both the reality of disability and the impossibility of her desired relationship. Real paralysis involves profound life changes, including loss of independence, chronic pain, medical complications, and extensive adaptations to daily living. Meg romanticizes disability as simply making her more compatible with Joe, rather than understanding the serious consequences she would face. Meg's attempt to get hit by Joe's police car presumably succeeds in injuring her, since the next scene takes place at the hospital. At the hospital, Joe finally sets Meg straight by explicitly explaining that a romantic relationship between them will never happen. The transcript does not detail exactly what Joe says, but his conversation apparently breaks through Meg's fantasies and makes her understand the inappropriateness of her feelings. Meg apologizes to Bonnie, who has been released from jail. The episode makes a joke about Bonnie being freed to keep getting her token voice work checks, which is a meta-reference to the character appearing rarely in episodes and serving limited narrative purposes. The resolution, where Meg simply apologizes and the situation resolves without serious consequences, troubled viewers who noted the severity of her actions. Meg framed someone for a crime, stole a police officer's weapon, stalked a married man, engaged in inappropriate behavior with his infant daughter, and attempted self-harm. These actions warrant serious intervention, including mental health treatment, legal consequences for the false imprisonment plot, and supervised restrictions on her contact with the Swanson family. Instead, the episode ends with a simple apology and apparent return to normal life. The subplot involving Stewie adds another layer of disturbing content focused on violence and murder. While at a park, Stewie encounters an older boy who insults him. Stewie attempts to take revenge by shooting the boy with one of his weapons, but the gun misfires. This failure makes Stewie believe he is losing his edge and becoming less evil. Stewie decides to boost his evil side by building a neural enhancement device designed to increase his capacity for villainy. However, the machine malfunctions and extracts Stewie's evilness, concentrating it into a physical clone rather than enhancing Stewie himself. The evil clone immediately demonstrates violent tendencies by attacking Brian. The clone attempts to choke Brian and cuts off his tail with some kind of blade. When Stewie discovers the clone's existence, the clone attacks Stewie as well before escaping from the house. The clone goes on a killing spree, murdering a woman in the process. The episode does not provide details about who this woman is or how the clone kills her, but treats the murder as a dark comedy plot point rather than a tragedy. The clone then lures the Kool-Aid Man, a mascot character, to his death. The clone gleefully drinks the Kool-Aid Man's contents after killing him, showing the clone takes pleasure in murder and torture. Stewie and Brian devise a plan to capture the evil clone by using Brian as bait. They tie up Brian, and the evil clone arrives as expected to kill him. The clone brings a ray gun to shoot Brian, but Stewie leaps onto the clone before he can fire. Stewie and the evil clone fight physically, and during the struggle they tear off their clothes. The image of two identical naked toddlers fighting creates uncomfortable viewing as the episode animates this extended battle. Brian eventually gains control of the ray gun during the fight, but faces a problem identifying which Stewie is the original and which is the evil clone, since they look identical. Brian solves this identification problem by instructing both Stewies to look at their feet. One Stewie looks down at his feet and starts giggling at the sight, which Brian interprets as the real Stewie's characteristic behavior. Brian shoots the other Stewie, believing he has killed the evil clone. The shot Stewie dies, and Brian and the remaining Stewie walk away together. However, as they leave, the remaining Stewie looks back at the camera with yellow monster eyes while maniacal laughter plays. This ending reveals that Brian actually shot the real Stewie, and the evil clone survived by successfully imitating Stewie's giggling behavior. The twist ending where evil Stewie kills and replaces real Stewie created controversy because it suggests the main character died and an evil imposter now lives with the Griffin family. Future episodes do not follow up on this storyline, treating it as a standalone dark ending rather than permanent character death. This inconsistency frustrated viewers who noted that episodes cannot have stakes if major character deaths get ignored by subsequent episodes. The ending also raises disturbing questions about whether evil Stewie continues living as the real Stewie in later episodes, or whether the yellow eyes and maniacal laughter were temporary effects that wore off. The episode's dual storylines both explore obsession taken to destructive extremes. Meg's obsession with Joe leads her to commit crimes, harm herself, and lose touch with reality. Stewie's obsession with being evil leads him to create a clone that murders people and potentially replaces him permanently. Neither storyline resolves with appropriate consequences or shows characters learning meaningful lessons. Meg apologizes, but faces no legal or mental health intervention for her criminal behavior and self-harm attempt. The Stewie clone apparently gets away with murder and identity replacement without anyone noticing the switch. Meg's characterization in this episode demonstrates the psychological damage caused by chronic social isolation and family mistreatment. Previous episodes established that Meg receives constant abuse and dismissal from her family and lacks friends or positive relationships outside the home. This episode shows how that isolation makes Meg vulnerable to developing inappropriate attachments to anyone who shows her basic kindness. Joe's willingness to be seen with Meg in public represents more positive attention than she receives from her own parents, making her interpret normal neighborly behavior as romantic interest. Real therapists recognize this pattern where people starved for affection develop inappropriate fixations on authority figures or caregivers who show them basic respect. Joe's position as a police officer adds another layer to the power dynamics. Joe represents legal authority in addition to being significantly older than Meg and married. The age gap between teenage Meg and adult Joe means any romantic relationship would be inappropriate regardless of Joe's marital status. The episode shows Joe eventually setting clear boundaries and rejecting Meg's advances. But his initial failure to immediately shut down her boundary violations when she started calling him by his first name and wearing Bonnie's dresses allowed the situation to escalate. Real professionals working with teenagers understand the importance of maintaining clear boundaries and immediately correcting inappropriate behavior to prevent situations like this from developing. Bonnie's arrest and imprisonment, based on Meg's planted evidence, represents a miscarriage of justice that the episode treats lightly. Bonnie sat in jail facing serious weapons charges while completely innocent. The episode never explains how Bonnie got released or whether the planted evidence was discovered. The joke about Bonnie being freed to continue getting voice work checks suggests she was simply let go without resolution of the criminal charges against her. Real people falsely accused, based on planted evidence, often face lengthy legal battles to clear their names even after release from custody. The breastfeeding scene involving Meg and Susie particularly troubled child welfare advocates who noted that having a teenager with no biological connection inappropriately breastfeed an infant for psychological gratification represents a form of child exploitation. Breastfeeding serves important nutritional and bonding purposes between biological mothers and babies, but Meg's breastfeeding of Susie served only to act out her fantasy of being Joe's wife and Susie's mother. Using a baby as a prop in pursuit of the baby's father crosses serious ethical lines regarding the child's well-being and agency. Meg's attempt to become paralyzed represents perhaps the episode's most disturbing element from a mental health perspective. Deliberately trying to acquire a disability to become romantically compatible with someone shows profound psychological disturbance, requiring immediate intervention. Real self-harm motivated by romantic obsession indicates serious mental health crisis, including possible erotomania, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or other conditions requiring professional treatment. The episode shows Meg receiving only a talking to from Joe at the hospital rather than psychiatric evaluation and treatment that would be mandatory after a deliberate self-harm attempt. The episode aired in March 2011 during Season 9, a period when Family Guy frequently pushed boundaries with disturbing content. Other Season 9 episodes dealt with controversial topics including domestic violence, murder, and psychological abuse. The show seemed determined to prove it could handle dark subject matter, but this episode demonstrates the challenges of treating serious issues like stalking, false imprisonment, and self-harm as comedy material. The episode wants credit for being edgy by depicting Meg's dangerous behavior while avoiding the serious consequences such behavior would actually trigger. The evil Stewie clone subplot adds gratuitous violence without connecting thematically to the main storyline about Meg and Joe. The two plots could exist in completely separate episodes without loss of coherence. The clone's murder spree and the ambiguous ending where evil Stewie potentially replaced the real Stewie feel disconnected from Meg's romantic obsession storyline. This structural weakness suggests the episode struggled to fill its runtime and added the Stewie plot primarily for shock value rather than narrative necessity. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have And Then There Were Fewer. And Then There Were Fewer. Family Guy, Season 9, Episode 1, aired on the 26th of September 2010 as a special hour-long season premiere with guest stars James Woods, Drew Barrymore, Ashley Tisdale, and Patrick Stewart. Written by Cherry Shevaprava-Dumrong and directed by Dominic Polsino, the episode became one of the show's most disturbing by permanently killing off multiple recurring characters in an Agatha Christie-style murder mystery. The episode traps the main cast and various Quahog residents in an isolated mansion where a serial killer systematically murders guests one by one, creating genuine tension and horror rarely seen in animated sitcoms. The episode's willingness to permanently remove established characters from the show demonstrated that Family Guy could have real stakes and lasting consequences rather than the typical cartoon reset button. The episode begins with Peter receiving an invitation to a dinner party supposedly held in his honor by an unknown host. The Griffin family arrives at a stately mansion surrounded by an ocean with rocky waters below. This isolated setting immediately establishes the classic locked room mystery scenario where characters cannot easily escape. After the Griffins arrive, several other Quahog residents show up, including Joe and Bonnie Swanson, Glenn Quagmire with his new girlfriend Stephanie, Tom Tucker, Diane Simmons, Dr. Hartman, Mort and Muriel Goldman, Mayor Adam West, Seamus, Herbert, Carl, and Jillian, with her husband Derek Wilcox. Each guest announces that the dinner party is supposedly in their honor as well, creating confusion about why they were all invited. The group decides to enter the mansion despite the strange circumstances. The maid Consuela leads them to the dining room, where they begin conversing while waiting for their mysterious host. The host is revealed to be actor James Woods, accompanied by his girlfriend Priscilla. Woods explains that he has become a born-again Christian and invited everyone to the party to make amends for all his past wrongdoing toward them. This setup references how Woods had antagonized various Quahog residents in previous episodes, giving multiple characters potential motives for wanting revenge against him. After Woods leaves the dining room, the first murder occurs suddenly when Quagmire's girlfriend Stephanie is shot. The guests immediately suspect Woods as the shooter and attempt to flee the mansion. However, a tree falls and collapses the bridge that serves as their only exit from the isolated property. This classic mystery trope of removing escape options traps all the guests on the property with a killer. They return to the mansion and attempt to call for help, but discover there is no cell phone reception and the landline telephone has been cut. These eliminated communication channels mean the guests cannot contact police or emergency services, forcing them to handle the situation themselves. Woods suddenly appears among the panicked guests, who immediately accuse him of murder. The group decides to take Woods to the scene where Stephanie was shot to confront him with evidence. However, when they arrive at the location, Stephanie's body has mysteriously disappeared. This development creates uncertainty about what actually happened and whether she is truly dead. The lights briefly go out, and when they come back on, the guests discover that James Woods has been stabbed. Woods dies from his stab wound, making him the episode's second murder victim and eliminating the primary suspect, since the dead cannot be the killer. With Woods dead and no longer a suspect, the remaining guests realize that one of them must be the murderer. They begin searching the mansion for clues and stumble upon a gun that has been rigged with a timer to automatically fire. This contraption was designed to shoot Woods, but instead it accidentally shot Stephanie earlier. This discovery reveals that Stephanie's death was a case of mistaken identity, where she died in Woods' place. The guests discuss who among them could have killed Woods, and the conversation reveals that each guest has a personal motive for wanting Woods dead based on how he wronged them in the past. This revelation causes tension as they begin fighting and accusing each other. During the chaotic argument, the guests stumble upon a secret entrance leading to a dimly lit study. Inside this hidden room, they discover Woods' secret diary, which documents all his misdeeds toward each of the guests. The diary provides written evidence of Woods' pattern of harming people and gives every guest a documented reason for wanting him dead. Another power outage occurs, plunging the mansion into darkness. When the lights return, Mort Goldman's wife, Muriel, has suddenly disappeared. The guests suspect Muriel might be the murderer and begin searching the mansion for her. However, they find Muriel stabbed to death, proving she was another victim rather than the killer. Muriel becomes the episode's third confirmed murder victim. Returning to the lobby, the group discovers that Priscilla has also gone missing. They immediately suspect her as the murderer since she was Woods' girlfriend and had access to plan the entire dinner party as a trap. Jillian's husband, Derek Wilcox, decides to search alone for a cell phone signal to call police. While separated from the group, Derek is struck with a Golden Globe Award and then pushed from one of the mansion's balconies. Derek falls to his death, becoming the fourth murder victim. His death demonstrates the danger of characters separating from the group, reinforcing the survival horror trope that isolation leads to death. The remaining guests decide to stick together as one group and agree that whoever leaves the group should be considered the true murderer. This pact creates paranoid tension as everyone watches everyone else for suspicious behavior. The group searches the bedrooms of various guests looking for evidence. They discover the Golden Globe Award that was used to kill Derek hidden underneath Tom Tucker's bed. This evidence implicates Tom Tucker as potentially being the murderer. The group also finds Priscilla hiding in a ceiling vent. When Priscilla is discovered, Tom Tucker panics and runs from the room, with the other guests chasing him. Tom's flight from the scene makes him appear guilty, solidifying him as the primary suspect. The next morning, police finally arrive at the residence. The fallen tree has presumably been cleared, or the guests found another way to contact authorities. Tom Tucker is arrested based on the evidence found in his room and his suspicious behavior of running from the group. With Tom in custody, the remaining guests begin preparing to leave the mansion. The mystery appears solved, with Tom identified as the killer and taken into police custody. However, Lois decides to speak privately with Diane Simmons about her feelings regarding having to anchor the news alone now that her co-anchor Tom has been arrested. During this conversation, Lois intuitively discovers that Diane is actually the true killer. Lois's realization triggers Diane to pull a pistol on Lois, taking her hostage. With Lois at gunpoint, Diane reveals her motivations for the murders. Diane explains that her life has been falling apart since she turned 40 years old. Tom Tucker had her replaced as co-anchor with a younger woman, destroying her career. Diane also reveals she had dated James Woods, and their relationship ended badly, leaving her depressed and vengeful. Diane admits she paid Priscilla to persuade Woods to become a born-again Christian focused on making amends with people he had wronged. This manipulation set up the dinner party scenario where Diane could gather all her targets in one location. Diane's plan was to murder Woods and frame Tom Tucker for the crime, simultaneously getting revenge on Woods for their failed relationship and on Tom for replacing her at work. However, the plan went wrong when Stephanie was accidentally killed by the timed gun that was meant for Woods. This unintended death forced Diane to murder additional people to cover up her identity. Diane killed Priscilla, Muriel, and Derek because they could potentially reveal information exposing her as the killer. Each additional murder was committed to protect Diane's identity and prevent witnesses from uncovering the truth. These cover-up killings demonstrate how murder often escalates as killers try to hide their initial crimes. With Diane holding Lois at gunpoint, she leads her to the edge of the island near the towering cliffs. Diane intends to shoot Lois and dispose of her body over the cliffs into the ocean below. Lois's knowledge of Diane's guilt makes her a witness who must be eliminated. However, before Diane can shoot Lois, Diane is mysteriously shot in the back by someone firing from an upstairs window. The bullet causes Diane to lose her balance and fall off the cliff to her death in the ocean. The shooter is revealed to be Stewie Griffin, who was positioned in an upstairs room with a suppressed sniper rifle. Stewie declares that the only one allowed to kill Lois would be himself, referencing his long-standing joke about wanting to kill his mother. Stewie's intervention saves Lois's life while simultaneously ending Diane's murder spree permanently. The episode resulted in the permanent deaths of 5 characters: Stephanie, James Woods, Muriel Goldman, Derek Wilcox, and Diane Simmons all died during the episode and never returned in subsequent episodes. The show committed to these deaths having lasting consequences rather than resetting everything by the next episode. James Woods was a recurring antagonist who had appeared in multiple episodes, making his death significant. Muriel Goldman was Mort's wife and had been a background character since early seasons. Derek Wilcox was a more recent addition as Jillian's husband. Stephanie appeared only in this episode as Quagmire's girlfriend. Diane Simmons had been the female news anchor since the show's beginning, making her death particularly impactful as she was an established recurring character. The episode generated significant discussion about its departure from typical Family Guy format. The hour-long runtime, serious murder mystery tone, permanent character deaths, and lack of cutaway gags created a viewing experience that felt more like a dramatic thriller than an animated comedy. The episode demonstrated that Family Guy could tell a cohesive story with genuine tension and stakes when it chose to abandon its usual random humor structure. Some viewers appreciated this ambitious storytelling experiment, while others felt it strayed too far from what makes Family Guy entertaining. Diane's characterization as the killer provided dark commentary on aging, sexism in media, and how career setbacks can destroy people's mental stability. Diane's life collapsed because she turned 40 and was replaced by a younger woman, reflecting real discrimination against aging women in television news. Her inability to cope with losing her career identity, combined with a failed romantic relationship, drove her to commit multiple murders. The episode suggests that society's devaluation of aging women can have devastating psychological consequences. However, the episode also shows Diane as completely responsible for choosing murder, rather than seeking healthier ways to process her anger and loss. The murder mystery structure borrowed heavily from Agatha Christie's novel And Then There Were None, which the episode's title references. Christie's novel features guests trapped on an island being killed, one by an unknown murderer among them. Family Guy adapted this classic mystery framework while adding its own characters and motivations. The isolated mansion, eliminated escape routes, cut communications, secret diary, revealing motives, and systematic elimination of suspects all come directly from Christie's template. The episode functions as both homage to and parody of classic murder mystery stories. The episode's animation and direction created genuine horror atmosphere rarely seen in Family Guy. The dimly lit mansion, shadowy corridors, sudden deaths, and mounting tension were animated and scored to create suspense rather than comedy. Characters showed real fear and desperation rather than the typical cartoon invincibility. The deaths were portrayed as tragic and permanent rather than comedic or temporary. This serious treatment of violence and murder distinguished the episode from Family Guy's usual approach, where characters survive absurd injuries without lasting consequences. Stewie's role as Diane's killer added moral complexity to the resolution. Stewie murdered Diane to save Lois, making it arguably justified homicide in defense of another person. However, Stewie is also a toddler who somehow obtained a sniper rifle and was positioned in the mansion ready to shoot people. The episode does not address how or why Stewie had this weapon, or whether his killing of Diane was legally justified. Stewie's closing statement that only he can kill Lois frames the murder as possessive rather than protective, suggesting his motivation was controlling who gets to kill his mother rather than saving her out of love. The episode's treatment of Stephanie's death as mistaken identity particularly disturbed some viewers. Stephanie died purely because she happened to be near where Woods was supposed to be when the timed gun fired. She had no connection to the larger conflict between Diane and Woods, making her death completely random from her perspective. Stephanie went to a dinner party with her boyfriend and died instantly without ever understanding why or who killed her. This arbitrary death reflects real situations where innocent people die as collateral damage in conflicts they had no part in creating. Muriel Goldman's death troubled viewers who noted she was killed simply because Diane feared she might reveal information. The episode never explains what Muriel knew or saw that made Diane target her. Muriel may have witnessed something suspicious, or Diane may have killed her purely as a precaution. Either way, Muriel died without understanding why she was targeted or having opportunity to defend herself. Her murder represents how killers often harm innocent bystanders to protect themselves rather than limiting violence to their intended targets. Derek Wilcox's death demonstrated how trying to help can result in becoming a victim. Derek volunteered to search alone for cell phone signal to call police, attempting to save everyone by getting professional help. His heroic action resulted in isolation that made him vulnerable to attack. Derek died while trying to rescue the group, making his death particularly tragic. The episode shows how people who take initiative to solve problems during crises can become targets precisely because their actions threaten the perpetrator's plans. The episode raised questions about whether Tom Tucker will face consequences for being falsely arrested. Tom was taken into police custody based on planted evidence and circumstantial behavior. The episode ends with Diane's guilt proven, but does not show Tom being released or exonerated. Real people falsely arrested for murder face enormous challenges even after being cleared, including legal fees, damaged reputations, and psychological trauma from being suspected of killing multiple people. The episode does not address whether Tom receives apology, compensation, or acknowledgement that he was wrongly accused. The permanent nature of the character deaths meant subsequent episodes had to adjust to these absences. The show lost Diane Simmons as the female news anchor, requiring either replacement or restructuring of news segments. Mort Goldman lost his wife, affecting his character going forward. Quagmire's relationship with Stephanie ended abruptly through her death. James Woods could never antagonize the characters again. These lasting changes distinguish this episode from typical animated shows, where characters can die and return without explanation by the next episode. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, Road to Germany. Road to Germany. Family Guy, Season 7, Episode 3, aired on the 12th of October 2008 with guest stars Gregory Jabara and Brian Blessed, and became one of the show's most disturbing episodes by sending a Jewish character back in time to Nazi-occupied Poland on the day of the invasion and using the Holocaust as comedy material. Written by Patrick Mahon and directed by Greg Colton, the episode centers on Mort Goldman accidentally traveling to the 1st of September 1939, forcing Brian and Stewie to rescue him from Nazi Germany. The episode concludes with Stewie committing premeditated murder to resolve a time travel paradox. The episode treats the Holocaust, World War II, and genocide as settings for adventure comedy while showing the main characters disguising themselves as Nazis and impersonating Adolf Hitler. The episode begins with the Griffin family and their neighbors watching the Academy Awards together at the Griffin house. During the viewing party, Mort Goldman desperately needs to use the bathroom. However, Meg is occupying the main toilet, leaving Mort without access to the primary bathroom. Mort's desperation grows so severe that he runs upstairs into Stewie's room, searching for any available toilet. He discovers what appears to be a portable toilet in Stewie's room and uses it without asking permission or examining it closely. This supposed toilet is actually Stewie's time machine, designed to look like a bathroom fixture. The time machine activates when Mort enters it and sends him backward through time to an unknown destination. Stewie realizes what happened when he discovers Mort has disappeared and recognizes that his time machine was activated. Stewie also realizes he does not have the return pad, which is a device that would bring time travelers back to the present automatically. Without the return pad, Mort is stranded in whatever time period the machine sent him to, with no way to return home. Stewie and Brian decide they must rescue Mort by taking the return pad and traveling back in time to find him and bring him home. This decision shows that, despite their usual selfishness, both characters recognize they have responsibility for Mort's safety since Stewie's invention caused the problem. Stewie and Brian use the time machine to travel backward and locate Mort. They arrive in Warsaw, Poland, and begin searching for him. They find Mort inside a synagogue, which provides their first clue about when they have arrived. The presence of an active synagogue in Warsaw with Mort inside suggests they are in a time period when Jewish religious practice was still possible in Poland. However, it does not take long for Stewie, Brian, and Mort to realize the exact date they have arrived on. Through context clues, including military activity and the behavior of people around them, they determine the date is the 1st of September, 1939. This date holds enormous historical significance as it marks the Nazi invasion of Poland, which began World War II in Europe. The three characters immediately understand the danger they face. The 1st of September, 1939, represents one of history's darkest days and the beginning of events that would lead to the Holocaust. The Nazi invasion of Poland initiated 6 years of occupation, during which approximately 3 million Polish Jews were murdered. Warsaw specifically was home to the largest Jewish ghetto in Nazi-occupied Europe, where hundreds of thousands of Jews were imprisoned in terrible conditions before being transported to death camps. The fact that Mort, Brian, and Stewie arrived on the invasion's first day means they are present at the beginning of genocide. For Mort specifically, as a Jewish man, being in Nazi-occupied Poland represents immediate mortal danger. The three attempt to use the return pad to travel back to the present and escape this dangerous situation. However, they discover the return pad is broken and will not function properly. This malfunction traps them in 1939 with a broken escape device while Nazi forces invade the city around them. They decide their best option is to travel to England, where they will be safe from Nazi occupation and can take time to repair the return pad without immediate danger. However, getting from Nazi-occupied Poland to England in 1939 presents enormous challenges since they must cross through or around Nazi-controlled territory while being pursued by Nazi forces. The Nazis begin chasing Stewie, Brian, and Mort, creating an action sequence where the three characters must escape Nazi soldiers and officers. They make their getaway on a motorcycle, which provides fast transportation away from their pursuers. The motorcycle chase represents the episode's first major action sequence, with the characters racing through 1939 Poland while Nazi forces attempt to capture them. This chase scene treats Nazi soldiers as generic action villains rather than acknowledging the historical reality of who these people were and what they would go on to do during the Holocaust. The motorcycle escape is followed by an elaborate underwater pursuit scene where the three characters hijack a U-boat submarine. German U-boats were submarines used by Nazi Germany's Navy during World War II to attack Allied shipping. The characters somehow manage to steal one of these submarines and use it to travel underwater, presumably through the Baltic Sea or other waterways toward England. The episode describes this as an elaborate undersea pursuit, suggesting Nazi forces continue chasing them even after they are underwater in the stolen submarine. This extended chase sequence through multiple vehicles and environments shows the episode fully committing to action-adventure storytelling rather than treating the Holocaust setting seriously. The three characters successfully make it to England safely, escaping Nazi pursuit and reaching Allied territory. Once in England and no longer facing immediate danger, Stewie examines the broken return pad to determine what repairs are needed. He discovers that the return pad is out of uranium fuel. Uranium is a radioactive element used in nuclear reactions and weapons. The return pad apparently requires uranium to power its time travel function. Stewie determines they need to obtain more uranium to refuel the device before they can return to the present. Stewie then faces a significant problem when he realizes the only place they can find uranium in 1939 is at a secret nuclear testing facility in Nazi Germany. This creates a situation where the characters must return to Nazi-controlled territory despite having just escaped from there. The episode's reference to Nazi Germany having a secret nuclear testing facility in 1939 is historically questionable. While Nazi Germany did pursue nuclear weapons research during World War II, the program was not as advanced as Allied efforts and did not have functional nuclear testing facilities in 1939. The episode takes creative liberties with historical accuracy to create a plot reason for returning to Nazi Germany. The three characters decide to join the Royal Air Force to gain access to aircraft they can use to reach Berlin. The RAF was Britain's air force and played a crucial role in World War II, particularly during the Battle of Britain, where they defended against German air attacks. The episode shows Brian, Stewie, and Mort somehow enlisting in the RAF and participating in a dogfight against the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe was Nazi Germany's air force. This dogfight sequence shows the characters engaged in aerial combat with German fighter planes while attempting to reach Berlin to obtain the uranium they need. The episode treats this Battle of Britain-style aerial combat as adventure spectacle, rather than acknowledging that real people died in these fights. Actual RAF pilots faced enormous danger during World War II with high casualty rates. Many young men died in aerial combat defending Britain from Nazi invasion. The episode uses these real historical battles as background for cartoon adventure without addressing the actual human cost of the war. The characters apparently survive the dogfight successfully and reach Berlin, Nazi Germany's capital city. Once in Berlin, Stewie implements a plan to obtain uranium from the secret nuclear facility. He disguises himself as Adolf Hitler to gain access to restricted areas and obtain the needed fuel. Hitler was the Nazi dictator responsible for the Holocaust, World War II, and the deaths of millions of people. Stewie impersonating Hitler involves dressing like him, mimicking his appearance, and presumably speaking with a German accent. The episode shows Stewie successfully convincing people that he is Hitler and using this disguise to obtain uranium from the nuclear facility. This impersonation treats one of history's most evil figures as a costume rather than acknowledging the horror he represents. While Stewie is disguised as Hitler and obtaining uranium, the group encounters the real Adolf Hitler. This meeting creates a situation where Stewie dressed as Hitler stands face to face with the actual Hitler. The real Hitler apparently sees through Stewie's disguise, or discovers their true identities. Hitler orders their immediate execution for infiltrating Nazi facilities and impersonating him. Nazi Germany regularly executed people for far less serious offenses, and impersonating Hitler himself would certainly result in death. The three characters face firing squad or other immediate execution for their crimes. However, before the execution can be carried out, Stewie, Brian, and Mort escape using the return pad. The uranium they obtained has refueled the device, making it functional again. They activate the return pad and travel forward through time back to the present, escaping from Nazi Germany seconds before being executed. This escape shows the time travel device working properly after being repaired and refueled. The three characters successfully return to Stewie's room in the present day after their adventure in 1939. The group arrives back in Stewie's room exactly 30 seconds before Mort originally entered the time machine. This precise timing creates a time travel paradox situation where two versions of Mort now exist in the same timeline. The Mort who traveled back in time with Stewie and Brian is present in the room, and in 30 seconds, the original Mort from before the time travel will enter the room seeking a bathroom. To prevent the events from repeating themselves and creating an infinite time loop, Stewie decides to kill the Mort who traveled with them through time. Stewie's solution to the time paradox involves premeditated murder. He shoves the time-traveling Mort into the time machine and blows it up, killing Mort instantly and destroying the time machine simultaneously. This act represents cold-blooded murder of someone who trusted Stewie and whom Stewie just spent the entire episode trying to rescue. Stewie saved Mort from Nazis and brought him home safely, only to murder him to prevent a time paradox. The episode treats this murder as a logical solution to a time travel problem, rather than as Stewie killing an innocent person. After Stewie murders the time-traveling Mort and destroys the time machine, the original Mort enters the room exactly as predicted. This original Mort is the version from 30 seconds before the time travel began, looking for a bathroom. However, the time machine no longer exists because Stewie just destroyed it. Without the time machine available, Mort cannot accidentally travel back in time. Instead of using the time machine as a toilet, Mort soils himself in Stewie's room because he has no other option available. The episode ends with Mort standing in Stewie's room having defecated on himself, while Stewie and Brian possess knowledge of adventures that this version of Mort never experienced. The episode generated massive controversy for multiple reasons. Using the Holocaust and Nazi Germany as settings for comedy adventure troubled many viewers, Holocaust survivors, Jewish organizations, and historians who felt the show trivialized genocide. The episode aired in 2008 when Holocaust survivors were still alive and able to see their trauma used as entertainment. The invasion of Poland and subsequent occupation led directly to the murder of 3 million Polish Jews, including nearly the entire Jewish population of Warsaw. Treating this historical tragedy as background for time travel adventure showed remarkable insensitivity to real suffering. The episode's treatment of the 1st of September 1939 as primarily a date that affects the main character's escape plans rather than the beginning of genocide troubled historians and educators. The date represents when Nazi forces began the invasion that would lead to establishing ghettos, concentration camps, and death camps throughout Poland. Millions of people died as direct results of events that began on this date. The episode focuses on whether Stewie, Brian, and Mort can escape rather than acknowledging the historical significance of the moment they are experiencing. Mort's characterization as a Jewish man sent to Nazi-occupied Poland on Invasion Day added another layer of disturbing content. The episode places a Jewish character in the most dangerous possible situation for Jewish people in modern history, then treats his fear and desperation as comedy. Real Jewish people in Nazi-occupied Poland faced systematic persecution, imprisonment, and murder. The episode uses this reality as the stakes for its adventure plot without adequately addressing the horror that real people experienced. Mort's presence in 1939 Poland should create crushing horror about what he would face if he stayed, but the episode treats it more as inconvenient danger that requires escape. Stewie's impersonation of Hitler particularly troubled viewers who felt dressing a baby character as Adolf Hitler crossed lines of taste and respect for victims. Hitler represents pure evil for millions of people whose lives were destroyed by his actions. Using Hitler as a costume for a cartoon character to infiltrate facilities treats him as a generic villain rather than acknowledging his historical reality. The episode shows Stewie successfully impersonating Hitler and people believing the impersonation, which suggests the show animated Stewie looking and acting like Hitler in ways convincing to other characters. The dogfight sequence with the RAF and Luftwaffe troubled military historians who noted the episode used real battles where real people died as background for cartoon adventure. The Battle of Britain involved British pilots defending their homeland from Nazi invasion at enormous personal cost. Many pilots died or were severely injured during these aerial battles. The episode treats these fights as exciting action sequences rather than historical tragedies, which disrespects the sacrifice of people who fought and died to stop Nazi Germany. The time travel paradox resolution, where Stewie murders Mort, raised ethical questions about whether killing a duplicate version of someone constitutes actual murder. From Stewie's perspective, killing the time-traveling Mort prevents a time loop while leaving the original Mort alive. However, from the time-traveling Mort's perspective, Stewie murdered him after saving him from Nazis. The time-traveling Mort was a thinking, feeling person with memories and consciousness who Stewie killed deliberately. The episode treats this as a clever solution rather than addressing whether Stewie had the right to decide which version of Mort gets to live. The episode's inclusion in the Road to series of episodes created additional controversy. Other Road to episodes involved Brian and Stewie traveling to different locations or situations, but this episode specifically chose Nazi Germany and the Holocaust as its setting. This choice suggested the show's creators viewed the Holocaust as equivalent to other Road to episode settings like Las Vegas or the North Pole, rather than recognizing the Holocaust as uniquely horrific and inappropriate for comedy treatment. The Academy Awards framing device at the episode's beginning created uncomfortable juxtaposition. The episode begins with characters watching Hollywood's celebration of filmmaking, then transitions to Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. This contrast between entertainment industry, glamour, and genocide felt jarring and potentially suggested equation between Hollywood excess and historical atrocity. The framing also meant Mort's desperate need to use the bathroom, caused by watching awards show, triggered the entire plot, making bathroom urgency the catalyst for a Holocaust-set adventure. The U-boat hijacking sequence raised questions about how the characters successfully stole and operated a German submarine. Real U-boats required trained crews to operate and involved complex mechanical systems. The episode does not explain how Brian, Stewie, and Mort gained the knowledge to pilot a submarine or how they physically overpowered a U-boat crew. This plot hole suggests the episode prioritized action sequences over logical storytelling or historical accuracy. The episode's portrayal of Nazi soldiers and officers as generic pursuers rather than individuals who chose to participate in genocide troubled educators who worked to ensure people understand Nazi crimes resulted from human choices. By making Nazis into faceless action villains, the episode potentially obscures the reality that real people chose to join Nazi military forces and participate in atrocities. The episode needed Nazis as antagonists for its chase sequences, but avoided engaging with the moral implications of who these people were and what they did. The return to England as a safe haven emphasized how Britain provided refuge from Nazi occupation, while much of Europe fell under Nazi control. This geographic safety allowed the characters to regroup and plan their next move. However, the episode does not address that Britain's ability to remain free required enormous sacrifice and that many parts of Europe lacked safe havens where Jewish people could escape Nazi persecution. The character's ability to simply travel to England oversimplifies the reality that most Jewish people trapped in Nazi-occupied territory had nowhere safe to flee. The nuclear testing facility plot device required the episode to invent or exaggerate Nazi nuclear capabilities for 1,939. While Nazi Germany did pursue nuclear weapons research during the war, the program lagged behind Allied efforts and never produced functional weapons. The episode's suggestion that Nazi Germany had operational nuclear testing facilities in 1939 with accessible uranium supplies does not match historical reality. This creative liberty served the plot, but potentially confused viewers about actual Nazi nuclear program capabilities. Stewie's successful infiltration of Nazi facilities, while disguised as Hitler, suggested security around Hitler was remarkably lax. In reality, Hitler had extensive security and people around him constantly. The idea that a toddler could convincingly impersonate him and gain access to restricted nuclear facilities requires enormous suspension of disbelief. The episode needed this impersonation to work for plot purposes, but the logistics make little sense when examined closely. The episode's musical number titled Mort the Jew added another controversial element by having a song specifically about Mort's Jewish identity. The transcript does not provide lyrics or context for this song, but the title itself suggests the episode called attention to Mort's Jewishness in ways that may have felt inappropriate given the Holocaust setting. Reducing someone's identity to their religious or ethnic background, especially in context of genocide against that group, creates discomfort and potential offense. The time travel mechanics never clearly explain why the time machine specifically sent Mort to the 1st of September 1939. Did it send him to a random date, or was there some logic determining the destination? The fact that it happened to send a Jewish man to Nazi Invasion Day suggests either remarkable coincidence or the time machine somehow targeted particularly dangerous destinations. The episode does not explore why this specific terrible moment in history was where Mort ended up. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Brian the Closer. Brian the Closer. Family Guy Season 13, Episode 4, aired on the 9th of November, 2014, and became one of the show's most disturbing episodes by depicting how cosmetic changes can corrupt someone's character and showing a protagonist deliberately scamming his friend out of thousands of dollars through fraudulent real estate practices. Written by Steve Marmel and directed by John Holmquist, the episode centers on Brian Griffin losing his teeth, getting extensive cosmetic dental work, and transforming into a manipulative real estate agent who ruins people's lives for commission. The episode explores themes of vanity, greed, betrayal of friendship, and how physical appearance changes can enable previously dormant cruel tendencies to emerge. The episode begins with Peter finding Brian's old rope toy. This discovery triggers Peter's determination to take the toy away from Brian, creating a conflict over the object. Peter's efforts to remove the rope toy from Brian result in Brian losing his teeth. The transcript does not specify exactly how the teeth are lost, but Peter's actions directly cause Brian to suffer significant dental damage. Losing multiple teeth represents serious injury that would cause pain, difficulty eating and speaking, and immediate need for dental care. The fact that Peter's childish game of tug-of-war causes this injury shows his typical reckless disregard for consequences. Brian finds himself unable to cope without his teeth. The loss affects his ability to function normally, presumably impacting eating, speaking clearly, and his self-image. Brian wants Lois to take him to the dentist for treatment, which represents the reasonable response to dental emergency. However, Lois refuses to spend money on Brian's dental care. This refusal shows the Griffin family's consistent pattern of treating Brian as less worthy of care than human family members, despite Brian being a central part of their household for years. Lois's unwillingness to pay for necessary medical care for a family member demonstrates cruel neglect, especially when Brian's injury resulted from Peter's actions in their home. Having a drink with Quagmire at a bar, Brian starts crying over his situation. The crying shows genuine distress about his dental condition and Lois's refusal to help. Quagmire, despite his usual antagonism toward Brian, shows unexpected kindness by giving Brian the number for his dentist. Quagmire even reveals he has an account at this dentist that Brian can apparently use. This generous gesture from someone who typically dislikes Brian demonstrates that even Quagmire recognizes Brian deserves medical care for his injury. The fact that Quagmire helps Brian when his own family will not highlights how dysfunctional the Griffin household treats Brian. Brian visits the dentist using Quagmire's account information and receives treatment. When he returns home, the family discovers the dentist has given Brian a prominent smile. The transcript describes this as a prominent smile rather than natural-looking replacement teeth, suggesting the dental work is noticeably artificial or excessive. The prominent smile apparently transforms Brian's appearance significantly, changing how others perceive him. This cosmetic alteration represents the episode's turning point, where Brian's external appearance begins affecting his internal character. Brian feels apprehensive about his new appearance initially. The family offers their support, encouraging Brian to accept his changed look. Brian begins finding that the new appearance suits him, developing confidence in his altered smile. This acceptance of cosmetic enhancement marks the beginning of Brian's character transformation from struggling writer to manipulative salesman. The prominent smile becomes Brian's defining feature that opens doors previously closed to him, demonstrating how physical appearance affects opportunities and treatment in society. While out for a walk, someone mistakes Brian for a real estate agent. This mistaken identity presumably stems from Brian's new confident appearance, with his prominent smile making him look like a successful professional. When the actual real estate agent shows up and discovers the misunderstanding, he offers Brian a job at his agency rather than being offended by the confusion. This job offer shows the agent recognizing qualities in Brian that suggest he would succeed in real estate sales. Brian accepts the position despite having no experience or training in real estate, entering a field notorious for high-pressure sales tactics and ethical gray areas. Brian discovers he has natural talent for selling properties. He successfully sells lots of properties quickly, earning substantial commissions and building a reputation as an effective agent. The episode shows Brian becoming a hit with the ladies as well, suggesting his sales success and confident appearance make him more attractive to women. This dual success in career and romance feeds Brian's ego and reinforces that his new appearance and sales career represent improvements to his life. However, the episode suggests Brian's sales success comes from manipulation rather than genuine service to clients. The real estate agency owner recognizes Brian's sales abilities and approaches him about tackling a particularly difficult property. The owner specifically mentions this condo as hard to sell, implying it has problems that make it unattractive to buyers. Taking on difficult-to-sell properties represents a test of a salesperson's skills, but it also creates pressure to use questionable tactics to offload problematic real estate. Brian accepts this challenge, viewing it as an opportunity to prove his abilities. Around this same time, Brian overhears Quagmire just receiving a substantial bonus, presumably from his airline pilot job. Learning about Quagmire's bonus gives Brian an idea. He realizes Quagmire has money available and could be targeted as a potential buyer for the hard-to-sell condo. Brian decides to approach Quagmire about the property despite knowing it is difficult to sell, which implies Brian understands the condo has problems that make it undesirable. Brian's decision to target his friend, who helped him with dental care, shows how his sales career has corrupted his values. Rather than using his position to help Quagmire find a good investment, Brian sees Quagmire as a mark to exploit for commission. Brian arrives at the gym where Quagmire works out, deliberately seeking him during his personal time rather than respecting boundaries. Brian pays Quagmire back for the dental work, clearing his debt and potentially making Quagmire feel obligated to listen to Brian's sales pitch. Brian then begins convincing Quagmire to buy the condo by presenting it as a great investment opportunity. This sales pitch deliberately misrepresents the property's value and potential, constituting fraud. Brian knows the condo is hard to sell because of problems, but tells Quagmire it represents a great investment, which is a direct lie. Brian shows Quagmire a promotional video about the property. This video presumably shows the condo in the best possible light while hiding or minimizing problems. Real estate fraud often involves misleading marketing materials that show properties as more desirable than reality. Quagmire remains hesitant after watching the video, showing good instincts that something is wrong with the deal. His hesitation suggests the video was not entirely convincing, and Quagmire has doubts about the investment. Seeing Quagmire's reluctance, Brian escalates his manipulation tactics. Brian tells Quagmire that a hated rival pilot is also interested in the property and might purchase it first. This claim creates artificial urgency and competition. Classic high-pressure sales tactics designed to force quick decisions without proper consideration. By invoking Quagmire's rivalry with another pilot, Brian exploits Quagmire's competitive nature and pride to override his rational hesitation about the investment. This manipulation specifically targets Quagmire's psychology to push him into a bad decision. The rival pilot claim convinces Quagmire to purchase the property. Brian's manipulation successfully overcomes Quagmire's good judgment, resulting in Quagmire buying the condo. This purchase represents a major financial decision made under false pretenses, which constitutes criminal fraud in real-world real estate transactions. Quagmire trusted Brian enough to consider the property and believed Brian's lies about it being a great investment and another buyer competing for it. This trust came directly from their friendship and Brian's recent debt repayment, which Brian exploited deliberately. After Quagmire completes the purchase, Peter, Joe, and Cleveland accompany Quagmire to visit his new property. When they arrive at the condo, they discover it is a rundown dump that was completely misrepresented during the sales process. The actual condition of the property bears no resemblance to how Brian described it or how it appeared in the promotional video. The condo is essentially worthless or requires massive investment to become habitable, making Quagmire's purchase a financial disaster rather than the great investment Brian promised. Joe Swanson, being a police officer familiar with laws, reveals important information about the purchase. He explains there is an escape clause in real estate contracts that is valid for 72 hours after purchase. This clause allows buyers to cancel the transaction and receive refunds within that time window if they discover misrepresentation or change their minds. This legal protection exists specifically to help victims of fraud recover from bad real estate deals. The 72-hour window gives Quagmire a limited time to undo the damage Brian caused. The group goes to the real estate office to find Brian and invoke the escape clause. However, when they arrive, Brian is not there. Office staff reveal that Brian has deliberately left town and is hiding specifically to avoid Quagmire for the next 72 hours. This premeditated evasion shows Brian knew exactly what he was doing when he scammed Quagmire. Brian planned his escape in advance, understanding that Quagmire would discover the fraud and seek to cancel the purchase. By hiding for 72 hours, Brian ensures the escape clause expires and Quagmire remains stuck with the worthless property. Brian takes refuge at a motel, believing this location will keep him safe from Quagmire until the legal deadline passes. However, Quagmire anticipated Brian's strategy and was already waiting at the motel when Brian arrived. This demonstrates Quagmire's intelligence and understanding of how Brian thinks. Finding Quagmire already there shows Brian that his friend knows him well enough to predict his moves, which makes Brian's betrayal even more personal. Quagmire tracked Brian down not just for financial reasons, but because the betrayal hurt him emotionally. Quagmire tells Brian that his already low opinion of him has been pushed even further by this fraud. Quagmire has never liked Brian, viewing him as pretentious, hypocritical, and self-centered. However, Quagmire still helped Brian with dental care when Brian needed it, showing basic human decency. Brian repaid that kindness by deliberately scamming Quagmire out of thousands of dollars. This betrayal confirmed Quagmire's worst opinions about Brian's character and proved Brian is even more selfish and cruel than Quagmire previously believed. Brian confesses to Quagmire that Quagmire may be his only friend. This confession appears to show vulnerability and regret, suggesting Brian recognizes he has burned bridges with everyone except Quagmire and now fears losing that last connection. The statement implies Brian values their relationship despite his actions suggesting otherwise. Brian's confession seems to indicate genuine remorse and desire to preserve some form of friendship even after committing fraud. This emotional moment appears to show Brian's better nature breaking through his corruption. However, Brian's confession is revealed to be only a manipulation tactic. Brian is not actually expressing genuine emotion or regret. Instead, Brian is stalling for time by pretending to care about friendship and feel remorse for his actions. He continues this manipulative conversation specifically to outlast the 72-hour escape clause window. Once enough time passes that the escape clause expires, Brian's facade drops, and he reveals he was lying about caring. This calculated emotional manipulation represents perhaps Brian's cruelest action in the entire episode. Brian's fake emotional confession shows he is willing to exploit even the language of friendship and vulnerability to achieve financial gain. He mimicked genuine remorse and caring to deceive Quagmire into letting time expire. This manipulation is worse than the initial fraud because it specifically targeted Quagmire's emotions and the slim possibility of salvaging their relationship. Brian deliberately gave Quagmire false hope about Brian having conscience or caring about their friendship, then revealed it was all an act once the legal window closed. Quagmire's response to this revelation is to knock Brian's teeth out. Quagmire punches Brian hard enough to destroy the prominent smile that started Brian's entire transformation into a manipulative sales agent. This violence returns Brian to his pre-dental work state, removing the cosmetic enhancement that enabled his sales career. Quagmire's action represents rough justice for Brian's fraud and betrayal, though it also constitutes assault. The fact that Quagmire destroys the exact thing that enabled Brian's corruption carries symbolic weight about removing tools that enabled wrongdoing. Brian returns to normal life after losing his teeth again. The family consoles him over losing his teeth and presumably his real estate career. However, the episode undercuts this moment of family support when Meg begins recounting her day. Before Meg can finish speaking, Peter intentionally causes himself a nosebleed to escape having to listen to her. This final joke returns the episode to its typical cruel treatment of Meg, while also suggesting the family's consoling of Brian was shallow and temporary. Peter would rather injure himself than hear Meg speak, showing the family's dysfunction continues unchanged. The episode's treatment of real estate fraud as comedy troubled viewers familiar with how property scams destroy lives. Real estate fraud causes people to lose life savings, retirement funds, and financial security. Victims of property scams often face foreclosure, bankruptcy, and years of financial recovery. The episode treats Brian's deliberate fraud as a character flaw rather than serious crime with devastating consequences for victims. While Quagmire is wealthy enough to potentially absorb the financial loss, Brian's other unnamed clients throughout his brief career may have been ruined by his manipulative sales tactics. Brian's character transformation demonstrates how superficial changes can enable latent cruelty to manifest. Brian always possessed selfishness and manipulative tendencies shown throughout the series. However, the prominent smile and sales success removed barriers that previously constrained his worst impulses. The cosmetic dental work gave Brian confidence and social access that he immediately weaponized against others. This suggests Brian's better behavior in other episodes stems from lack of opportunity rather than genuine morality. The episode's exploration of how physical appearance affects opportunities and treatment reflects real social dynamics around attractiveness and professional success. Brian's prominent smile opened doors that were closed when he looked normal. People treated him better, offered him opportunities, and trusted him more based purely on appearance rather than character or qualification. This advantage allowed Brian to enter real estate and succeed initially. However, Brian used these unearned advantages to harm people rather than provide genuine service. The real estate industry setting provides perfect environment for Brian's corruption because it rewards manipulation and prioritizes commissions over client welfare. Real estate agents face pressure to close deals regardless of whether properties suit buyers' needs. The industry structure incentivizes agents to push sales even when buyers would be better served walking away. Brian entered this ethically compromised field and immediately adopted its worst practices without resistance. His lack of training or licensing apparently posed no barrier to selling properties and earning commissions. Brian's targeting of Quagmire, specifically as a fraud victim, adds betrayal to the criminal fraud. Quagmire helped Brian when his own family refused, providing access to dental care that transformed Brian's life. Brian responded to this kindness by identifying Quagmire as vulnerable target due to his recent bonus. The decision to defraud specifically the person who helped him shows Brian's complete moral bankruptcy. Rather than feeling gratitude or obligation to treat Quagmire well, Brian saw Quagmire's generosity as weakness to exploit. The episode's resolution, where Brian loses his teeth again, and presumably his sales career, represents surface-level consequences without addressing deeper issues. Brian faces no legal prosecution for fraud, no requirement to compensate victims, and no lasting damage to his reputation. The only consequence is losing the cosmetic enhancement that enabled his crimes and presumably ending his real estate career. However, Brian's willingness to commit fraud, manipulate friends, and fake emotions for financial gain reveals character problems that losing teeth does not fix. Quagmire's violence against Brian raises questions about proportional response and vigilante justice. While Quagmire's anger is understandable, given Brian's fraud and manipulation, physically assaulting someone and destroying their teeth constitutes criminal battery. The episode frames Quagmire's violence as justified revenge, rather than addressing that it represents additional wrongdoing. Two wrongs do not make a right, and Quagmire's assault, while emotionally satisfying to viewers, does not legally or ethically address Brian's fraud. The cosmetic dentistry element satirizes how appearance-based advantages distort society and enable unqualified people to succeed. Brian had no real estate training, knowledge, or ethics, but succeeded purely based on looking confident and trustworthy. His prominent smile convinced people to trust him with major financial decisions, despite having no credentials justifying that trust. This reflects real problems, where attractive people receive opportunities based on appearance rather than merit, creating systems where surface presentation matters more than substance. The episode never shows what happens to the worthless condo Quagmire purchased or whether he eventually recovers his money through legal channels. Real estate fraud victims can pursue civil lawsuits and criminal charges, potentially recovering losses if they prove intentional misrepresentation. However, legal processes are expensive and time-consuming, and many victims never fully recover their losses. Quagmire's wealth may allow him to pursue legal action, but Brian's other unnamed victims may lack resources to fight back against his fraud. Brian's fake emotional confession represents one of the most psychologically manipulative acts shown in Family Guy. Pretending to care about friendship and express vulnerability specifically to run out a legal clock demonstrates sophisticated cruelty beyond simple selfishness. Brian crafted a performance designed to manipulate Quagmire's emotions and create false hope about reconciliation. This calculated psychological warfare shows Brian possesses capacity for elaborate deception when motivated by self-interest. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.